Test 2, 3. Test. C'est très bon pour moi. Parfait. Merci. Test 1, 2. Test 1, 2, 3. C'est parfait pour moi. Merci. Merci beaucoup.
Okay, testing on English, testing on English. Yeah, do it. Doing an interpreter test for English. English test, English test.
You have it now for speaking?
I don't hear it. English test, English test. Okay, I hear you. I hear the English. Doing French test, going to French. Okay, got the French test. Thank you. What's your name, Raiko?
Aoki, Mrs. Aoki.
Hi, Oki. This is Alex. We'd like to do an audio test if possible.
Sure.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi, we can hear you loud and clear. If you could
Right.
talk for maybe 2 seconds, tell me about the weather.
The weather in Tokyo today was very nice.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the launch of the Competitive Neutrality Toolkit. I'm Federica Majorano from the OECD Competition Division. Before starting with the agenda, we would like to show you a short video we have prepared. Thank you.
Competitive neutrality is a principle according to which government intervention in the market, for instance as a regulator or as a producer or buyer of goods and services, does not distort the level playing field for companies. Promoting competitive neutrality ensures that companies can compete on equal terms regardless of their ownership structure or where their headquarters are based. Now, benefits for citizens may include lower prices, greater choice, and better quality of goods and services. And in the end, the whole economy benefits because competition increases productivity and economic growth, multiplying business opportunities and employment. Global challenges such as climate change and the recent unfortunate COVID-19 pandemic that have led to greater economic intervention. This is the right role of the states, but these so well-intended policies can lead to distorting competition as an unintended consequence. Against this backdrop, now the OECD developed the Toolkit of Competitive Neutrality Good Practices to help governments ensure open and fair competitive markets. And this is based on the OECD recommendation on competition neutrality adopted by all OECD countries in 2021.
First, governments should ensure all companies face the same regulatory environment. If established companies are exempted from new and stricter requirements, newcomers will not be able to compete on equal terms, even if they offer better quality and more innovative products and services. Second, in a context of renewed interest in industrial policy, governments should avoid selective and discriminatory practices that favor certain competitors at the expense of others. Industrial policy should be focused on cases where the market on its own cannot achieve a desirable outcome for society, for example, investment in research and development. Third, governments should ensure that public procurement rules treat all potential bidders in a similar way, including for state-owned enterprises.
To wrap it up, in an environment where the state has a more active role, competitive neutrality really can make markets work more and more effectively.
Back to the room then. Now I would like to invite, please, Deputy Secretary General Takeuchi and the Chair of the OECD Competition Committee, Frédéric Geny, on stage. Thank you. And I leave the floor to Deputy Secretary General.
Well, thank you very much. Distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor to be here today at the launch of the OECD Competitive Neutrality Toolkit. This marks a significant achievement in our efforts to promote fair competition and transparency across sectors. Before we dive into our agenda, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the hard work of the Secretariat and the collaboration of relevant committees that made this initiative possible. In my remarks today, I'd focus on two areas. First, the importance of competitive neutrality and why it matters. And second, the OECD's efforts to advance competitive neutrality, particularly through the launch of OECD Competitive Neutrality Toolkit we are unveiling today. So first was the importance of competitive neutrality. Competitive neutrality is a principle according to which state intervention in the market does not create unfair advantages. This applies, for example, when the state acts as a regulator or as a buyer of goods and services. The overall aim is to maintain a level playing field for companies and prevent situations where the state grants advantages to certain entities selectively, thus distorting competition within the market. Competing firms should face the same set of rules and enforcement of those rules. In addition, competitive neutrality means preventing situations where financial advantages, such as state support to specific competitors, undermine fair and open markets for all. Global challenges have led to growing government intervention in the economy in recent years. These policies decisions have often stemmed from the needs to respond to geopolitical tensions or steering towards the green economy. However, this may also distort the economy. For example, government funding provided on a rolling basis, the amount of funding relative to the size of the market, or government support programs that favor some competitors can lead to long-term distortion to competition across domestic and global markets. Ensuring competitive neutrality is important so that competition can work properly and deliver benefits to consumers and the economy as a whole. So this leads to the OECD's role. Over the last 20 years, the OECD Competition Committee has been working to promote competitive neutrality. The need to intensify these efforts was stressed during the 2017 OECD Ministerial Council meeting, which recognized, quote, the need to address market failures and prevent government policies and business practices that distort competition, including state aid and subsidies, unquote. In response, the Competition Committee developed the recommendation on competitive neutrality, which was adopted in 2021 as the first international instrument on the topic. The recommendation represents a holistic and multidisciplinary reflection of how to prevent situations where advantages granted to some undermine fair and open markets for all. This is important not only for domestic markets, but also for trade and international competition. The recommendation covers key areas, namely competition law, regulatory environment, public procurement, state support, and public service obligations. It looks to ensure neutral and fair government actions by urging governments to apply the same rules to all businesses and to avoid distorting competition when supporting companies. So we had this recommendation, but more need to be done to support implementation of it. In this regard, the Competitive Neutrality Toolkit, which we are launching here today, helps implement competitive neutrality principles set out in the key areas of recommendation mentioned earlier. First, the toolkit outlines a set of good practices based on examples from international experience to support public officials in identifying and reducing distortions to competition due to state intervention. This is particularly relevant for governments in resisting the temptation to favor specific companies when developing state support measures. It is not enough to say a subsidy would encourage firms to adopt more sustainable production processes. It is important to elaborate on how this will be achieved, how it will change the firm's behavior, and whether firms would have made these changes without the subsidy. In this regard, the toolkit invites policymakers to clearly define and specify their objectives. Second, the toolkit provides a framework for analysis to identify and assess regulations and policies that may distort competitive neutrality and to develop alternatives to avoid and reduce such distortions. The toolkit, as well as the recommendation, are not only about the design of regulation and policies, but also their accurate and actual enforcement. For example, state-owned enterprises, SOEs, are subject to competition law. But competition authorities may face political pressure to be more lenient, given that SOEs often play an important role for a country's economy or perform social objectives. Favoring any competitor undermines a level playing field and prevents the benefit of competition from reaching the market, which the toolkit looks after to address. And here I would like to remind you that it is important to underscore that the competitive neutrality is a horizontal policy issue, impacting key areas such as trade, state-owned enterprises, and public procurement. And in this regard, the OECD has adopted a holistic and organizations-wide approach with coordinated efforts across multiple committees to effectively address this topic. A number of examples. The OECD Guidelines for Corporate Governance of State-Owned Enterprises, SOE Guidelines, is the leading global standard for ownership and governance of SOEs. The SOE Guidelines address the growing role of SOEs in global markets and international value chains, with recommendations that promote level playing field and fair competition when SOEs engage in economic activities. This area has been further strengthened with the recent revision of SOE guidelines undertaken by the Working Party on State Ownership and Private Practices. In addition, the Steel Committee and the Trade Committee have conducted studies of subsidies in sectors such as steel and aluminum, which among other findings reveal that companies with greater government ownership tend to receive more state support. This provides valuable evidence for the importance of promoting competitive neutrality. So, dear colleagues, the launch of the Competitive Neutrality Toolkit presents a unique opportunity to bring together different communities and enhance our efforts to promote competitive neutrality. So thank you very much for your attention and participation, and I look forward to the discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for joining our event and your kind welcome remarks. Now I give the floor to the chair of the Competition Committee, Professor Frédéric Génie.
Oh, sorry. Dear Secretary General Takeuchi, dear moderators, dear speakers to this event, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to participate in the launch of this Competitive Neutrality Toolkit. A lot has been said already, both in the original presentation and in what the Deputy Secretary General has mentioned. So you will forgive me if I come back on some of the themes which have been alluded to. But I would like to focus on three things. First, explain why we should be interested in competitive neutrality and why we are. Second, to tell you about the work that the OECD Competition Committee has been doing on the topic in the last 20 years. Third, give you a very quick sense of what the toolkit looks like, what it is all about. And finally, touch, of course, on the delicate question of industrial policy, but more generally, the horizontal nature of the issue of competitive neutrality. We will have two roundtables that will follow this introduction. One which will be on the good practices when it comes to competitive neutrality, and one which will be on the policy implications of competitive neutrality. And this covers very well what I'm trying to say in this introductory remark. So first, let me restate what do we mean by competition neutrality and why it is important? I think that competitive neutrality can be understood in two different ways. On the one hand, it is a market situation in which institutional factors neither favor nor discriminate against any incumbent or potential player. From this situation, we derive the principle that a market to have an effective competition must respect the principle of competitive neutrality, because otherwise what we're going to have is a distorted competition or an unfair competition, and distorted or unfair competition will not lead to the expected benefits from competition. So the first reason why we're interested in this is that there's a very wide scope of government interventions. Some of them are already taken care of, I would say, because some of them come into regulations or laws which are passed, but many of them are not the result of formal state policies, but more questions of how the administrative world deals with the various actors on markets. And this aspect is not something which is typically covered in competition law. If it is in many competition law, there's an exemption for laws or regulations that may limit competition, but there is no real exemption for favoring large state-owned enterprises when it comes, for example, to providing loans on interesting basis. Now, it's quite important to have a competition that actually delivers, both at the macroeconomic level, and that's mostly because of the benefits that consumers derive from the macroeconomic, from the competition at the macroeconomic level, but also at the macroeconomic level, because competition on the merits basically suggests that the result of the competitive process will be favorable to the most efficient firms, which will save resources and allow the economic development, as well as possibly, there's a little bit more uncertainty there, but innovation. So we do want to have competition, both for the macroeconomic reason and the macroeconomic reasons which are mentioned. We do want competition which is not biased, competition which is really on the merit. And we know that there's a gap in competition law because a lot of influences exercised by the states are not really covered by the existing competition laws. So the notion of the principle of respecting the competitive neutrality is something additional to what exists and which fills the gap that exists in our apparatus. Now, the OECD Competition Committee has been working to promote competitive neutrality over the last 20 years, and we have come again and again, very often on this topic. This has been done through different tools and from different angles. We held 2 roundtables in 2004 and 2009, which started our work on this. And then the Competition Committee developed joint work with the OECD Working Party on State Ownership and Privatization Practices to map national practices and policies that address competitive neutrality between state-owned enterprises and privately owned enterprises, as well as develop OECD standards bearing on competitive neutrality. In 2015, the Competition Committee held another roundtable on the topic and prepared an inventory of competitive neutrality distortions and measures. And we tried to classify the various types of distortions, the rules and tools which were available in various jurisdictions, and to identify the gaps that existed. This mapping exercise was broader and went beyond the competitive neutrality between state-owned and privately owned enterprises, but also comprised competitive neutrality among privately owned enterprises. The notion of state-owned enterprises, at least in the competition world, has evolved over time because we've started talking about state-owned enterprises, and then we went to the concept of state-supported enterprises, which were not necessarily owned by the state, but nevertheless were, for strategic reasons or other reasons, very well considered. But it's with the development of globalization and international trade, the issue of, for example, competition between importing firms and domestic firms became also an issue, and an issue where domestic firm could be favored compared to foreign firms. So the competitive neutrality between the private firms became also an issue of competitive neutrality. The recommendation that you've just heard about, which was adopted by the OECD, provide that the adherent members should ensure competitive neutrality when the state intervene in different ways. When the state intervenes, for example, by establishing and enforcing the regulatory environment, so the laws and regulations should be enforced in a neutral way, applied to everybody. When the state participates in markets as a seller or as a buyer of goods and services, so that means that on public procurement, for example, there shouldn't be preferential treatment of some of the bidders compared to others. When the state intervenes by influencing the choices of suppliers through state support, and when the state intervenes by supporting the provision of public service by either privately owned or state-owned enterprises. As has been said by Deputy Secretary General Takeuchi, the competitive neutrality principle is not only, it's certainly very relevant for anybody who works on competition, because clearly there can be a distortion of competition. But it's not only relevant to competition policy, it is relevant to many other policies across the OECD. And therefore, this is a topic of interest to many policymakers, hence the second roundtable that we're going to have this afternoon. Now, one difficulty came up in the discussion that we've had. There was some reservation by some on the fact that the issue was not so much the neutrality of, the neutrality principle, but the issue was the fact that the state should not intervene in the first place. And that by talking about an intervention which should be neutral, we were in fact facilitating or at least promoting the possibility of intervention. I think that this is a misreading of the situation, because what we are saying is not that unduly restrictive regulation should be applied in a neutral way. It is, and one has to look at the recommendation on competitive neutrality together with other recommendations, and in particular, the recommendation on competition assessment, which tries to minimize the interference of states in markets and in economic matter to what is strictly necessary and could not be solved by the market. So this is not an issue of promoting regulation and saying that regulation is acceptable if it is neutral. Neutrality is one dimension, but necessity is another one, and we have different recommendations that have to be read in common to understand this issue. After the approval of the recommendation on competitive neutrality, the Competition Committee started preparing the toolkit that we are launching today to support the implementation of competitive neutrality principles. The Deputy Secretary General has already talked about the toolkit, so I'll be very brief there. It's a set of good practices for each of the possible areas. Let's say that it's a systematic way of thinking about competitive neutrality with the tools at each step that one can use to either identify the lack of competitive neutrality or analyze the lack of competitive neutrality. Is this the lack of competitive neutrality necessary for whatever reason? And how do I remedy, or how do we remedy it if it is not strictly necessary? The toolkit, as any toolkit, has lots of examples which are taken from the work which has been done in the Competition Committee to help us understand what the issues were, which issues were addressed in different countries and how they were handled. One thing which I think is important is, of course, this is an OECD toolkit. So it is a toolkit for the OECD members. But when you think about it, and particularly when you go to developing non-OECD member countries, you realize that the importance of the state actions on the economy is considerable, probably much larger, in fact, than in many of the OECD countries, and that in those countries, there's also a need to allow the development of locally efficient firms to try to promote the competitive neutrality principles. So this toolkit is really a toolkit not only for the OECD members, but also for the non-members. And I think, as I said, that in developing country, it could be extremely useful. Okay, today we have policymakers that from different areas, and those different areas will, I think, benefit from the toolkit as well, because there's a set of systematic questions that one can ask about each of the policies which are implemented, and checks and possible remedies that can be suggested. Let me finish with the issue of industrial policy. As you've heard before, this is a very important issue. Why? Well, first of all, because there's a resurgence of industrial policy in many countries in the Western world, and particularly in the OECD members. But second, because industrial policy means, in general, a state action which will try to promote either an activity or sometimes some firms that want to enter into this activity, or research and development that might lead to a new technology. So the way in which industrial policy works is through state intervention And that state intervention, by the way, may not be only national, it may be local, or it may be provincial. So when we talk about the competitive neutrality principle, it applies at all levels of governments and not only at the central level of government. There is no question that industrial policy can distort competition, and that this is a reason why historically there's been, I would say, charitably, at least reservation on the part of competition authorities towards the industrial policy specialists, but we have moved on from that. And to move on from this, there are two ways to do it. One of them is to promote the competition principle in the industrial policy actions, to try to see what kind of industrial policy could be consistent with competition or neutral in the case. There's, of course, a second dimension, which we are not going to talk about today, but which I think is important to OECD, which is how can competition policy adjust to the objectives of those other policies as well? Because I think it's a question of mutual adaptation. Is it true or is it not true, for example, that competition authorities sometimes have too narrow a perspective or too short a perspective, whereas industrial policy makers tend to have a longer term, they tend to think about markets that don't really exist yet today, or about position that could be gained in the future. So I think that one of the important pieces of the agenda at OECD is this mutual dialogue between competition and industrial policy or trade policy, but industrial policy in particular, because it's very much high on the political level, and that we can enrich each other quite a bit if we have a balanced discussion between the two of us. So when it comes to competitive neutrality, what is the relationship or the direct relationship with industrial policy? It's really about the design of the policies and to make sure that this design does not in itself include a lack of neutrality, either vis-a-vis state-owned or state-supported firms or vis-a-vis some firms and against some others. The way in which, for example, research and development tax incentives are designed is a place where there could be a lack of competitive neutrality. And there are many different specific sub-policies of industrial policy that one could look at to make sure that the principle of competitive neutrality is respected. You will see in the toolkit that there are suggestions about good practices when it comes to industrial policy and competitive neutrality. I take just one of them, one of the good practices in the competitive neutrality toolkit, which is that state support should include exit strategies to avoid that it is perpetuated beyond the necessary. Okay. Now, this is a very indirect way in which there can be a lack of kind of a grandfather's clause. I mean, you have always gotten support for this kind of research and development, and you continue because you've invested so much. But that has deleterious effects on the possibility of entry. It creates barriers to entry, and eventually it can lead to waste and or barriers to entry and lowering of competition. So, what is the role, to finish, to conclude, what is the role of competition authorities with respect to this competitive neutrality toolkit? I think it's first to have a clear objective, to integrate this dimension in, particularly in their advocacy function, so that they can let it be known why some of the other policies are not respecting the principle of competitive neutrality. Second, try to help other policymakers to find the least. It's not a question of contesting the other policies. It's a question of finding the least distortive way to achieve the goals, which are the goals that other policymakers have, because there are usually several ways to get a particular result. And third, to promote the idea that the ex post evaluation of government intervention is a very useful tool because it forces you to think again, to know whether your past analysis is still relevant and whether there are new or easier remedies that could be applied. I'm sure that the panels today will give us plenty of opportunities to discuss these good practices in action and how we work across policy communities to address the level playing field using the competitive neutrality principles and the toolkit of OECD. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. Now we can move to the first panel. So I invite the panelists and the moderator, Ori Schwartz, head of the OECD Competition Division, to replace us on stage. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, dear colleagues, it is a pleasure to welcome you to our first panel of today, good practices in leveling the playing field, experiences of competition authorities. Before launching into the discussion, let me provide a brief overview. As we've heard, in 2021, the OECD adopted the recommendation on competitive neutrality. It provides principles so that government actions remain competitively neutral and that enterprises faces the level playing field regardless of the ownership, location, or legal form. The Competitive Neutrality Toolkit, which we are launching today, helps implement the recommendation and covers all main themes, namely competition, law enforcement, regulatory environment, public procurement, state support, and public service obligations. A unique aspect of this toolkit is that it draws on the experience of competition authorities who carried the torch of competitive neutrality, for example, through enforcing merger controls and prosecuting cartels, as well as making recommendations to the governments and other public bodies to promote competitive neutrality. This expertise helps government enhance the regulatory framework by incorporating real-world strategies to make them more pro-competitive. So during this panel, we very much look forward to hearing from competition authorities as they share concrete examples and highlight good practices across the policy areas covered by the toolkit. We hope these insights, together with the toolkit, will allow the broader policy community to better understand the good practices and promote their use. Before diving into our discussion, let me introduce our distinguished speakers. So to my left, Ms. Connie Fernandez, President of Spain CNMC. To her left, Ms. Marisa Tierno Cantella, the newly appointed Head of International in the DG Competition European Commission. If I may take this opportunity to congratulate you on the recent appointment. And joining us online, the two other speakers, Ms. Reiko Aoki, Commissioner in the Japanese Fair Trade Commission. And last, but certainly not least, Ms. Andrea Marvan-Saltiel, Chairwoman of COFECE Mexico. Thank you very much for joining us today. We will kick off the discussion with the topic of state support. As we've heard, a very, very timely topic considering recent developments like the rise of industrial policy and the green transition. And if I may start with you, Marisa, the EU competition law, unlike many other competition law, have a very predefined and specific regime on competitive neutrality, which is the state aid. And could you please share with us the reason, the rationale behind this legal regime, and perhaps provide also one or two good examples for the benefits for the European economy that you have because of this regime?
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here and to join this panel. Yes, indeed. Well, the European Commission is a body that is responsible for looking into state aid that is provided by the member states. And of course, it was conceived, this system, by the founding parents of the EU. At the time, it was not called EU, as a crucial element in order to ensure that there was a level playing field in the single market, and that the very single market was built. So it is one of our competition tools because, as was explained at the beginning by Frédéric Geny, it is a matter of competition distortion if, for instance, one of our member states would be providing state aid to some company, and then the competitors that are the competitors of that company in other member states would not have the same help from their own member states. So that would be a distortion of competition because one company would be, backed by these possibilities and the others not. So one clear example of how bad these situations could be is when you are keeping alive an ailing company in an area where you have overcapacity. And then you are exporting the problem of that member state if you are providing this aid to the rest of the member states with the competitor that may be not ailing, but real competitive companies. So a member state may consider that it has a no fiscal capacity or no wish to proceed in that useless race of helping each other's companies. So, of course, state aid can be sometimes granted, for instance, when you need to ensure that there is delivery of certain public services, when for reasons of public objectives, you need to do something because there is a market failure. And then I have a couple of examples of our member states having gone a bit deeper in this trend of neutrality at national level. So I'm going to speak about Denmark and the Netherlands very shortly. So we know that Denmark is scrutinizing measures of public support that are not covered by state aid rules. So for instance, when they go under the minimis threshold for our scrutiny. And also in the Netherlands, they have introduced a law on market and government, the Wetmarkt en Overheid, where they have certain rules regarding full cost coverage for public goods and services, not favoring public undertakings, and separation of regulatory and economic activities. And with this, just to say that the European Commission wholeheartedly supports the toolkit that is provided by the OECD. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you mentioned in your intervention the regulations and laws that specific EU countries have, and one of them is Spain. And in Spain, the CNMC has a role in this sense in maintaining the level field. So could you please share with us kind of the legal framework around this law?
Thank you very much, Ori. It's a pleasure being here. And let me start by stating that the CNMC has really being committed in the idea of participating in both the elaboration of the recommendations on competitive neutrality, the recommendations that were established in 2021, and also in the preparation of the toolkit, because both instruments we believe are going to be extremely helpful in our day-to-day work. And just to illustrate this with an example, the CNMC published a document in 2021 called Recommendations to the Public Authorities for an Intervention in Favor of Market Competition and an Inclusive Economic Recovery. The report is covering 3 areas in which we provide 10 recommendations to state intervention so as to make it more competitive and more competitive neutral. These areas are in fact market regulation, public support, state aid, and public procurement. And as you can imagine, there are several references to the competitive neutrality principle in the wording. So it's just to illustrate how useful this is going to be, I guess, for all the competition authorities. So now, regarding the state aid in particular, let me explain which are the powers that the CNMC has regarding state support. As Marisa was explaining, it is for the European Commission to provide a first analysis on whether the state that any member state forces to provide to a company is compatible or incompatible with the European market. But we do have some competencies as well in this area that I think are extremely useful in order to assess whether the state aid that has been provided has a positive impact in competition or not, in order to help us design better the next editions of state aid. In particular, we at the CNMC, we issue an annual report regarding state aid granted in Spain with the cooperation of the European Union, because it is the European Union, the Commission, who will be providing us with the information. We then analyze how this aid was granted and how the impact was being felt in our territory. The report is published with a delay of 2 years, because that's the time in which we receive the information, we analyze it, but it is very useful in order to see what's going on. The second area in which we have some jurisdiction or some competences in state aid is to issue sectoral reports to address recommendations for a better design. And those reports are based on impact assessment, which is, I think, something that competition authorities are more and more committed to do in order to see whether our actions are helping, in fact, to have a better and a more vibrant economic activity. So to give you 2 examples of these sectoral studies, we issued a report concerning subsidies granted for the acquisition of electric vehicles. This is a report that we issued in 2021, where we carefully examined the requirement, some of the requirements imposed in the conditions for the granting of the subsidies that we consider being not neutrally competitive in this particular case. For example, the requirement that in order to be granted the subsidy, you have to buy the car at a given or in a local dealer. So you were not able to buy, for example, your car in another region. And of course, this had an impact in competition, because this was protecting competitors from a real competition, and then damaging consumers who could not access to better prices. So we consider this as an unjustified restriction on competition, and we issued recommendation to avoid this geographical limitation. Most of the regions that were issuing these subsidies corrected it, and those that did not do it, well, we're faced with a litigation from our part, as we do have a standing to do this, and also we're corrected. The other example is a more recent study published in 2022 in relation to the deployment of broadband networks between 2013 and 2020. We wanted to see the impact of the subsidies granted in the deployment of FTTH, so the fiber to home, which was the most widespread technology for connectivity. And we were more interested in knowing not as much how the deployment had been in terms of how extensive it was, but how subsidies had helped to access the broadband, so the use of the broadband. And because we understood that the success was here more important in how I mean, those that were benefiting from the subsidy were really accessing, and we estimate a very positive impact in that. We are now currently deciding on which will be the next studies in sector, and it may be self-consumption, but yeah, we will see. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Kani. Moving now to the other side of the globe, to Japan. Reiko, the JFTC has published guidelines on competitive neutralities. So if you could give us a taste of what is there in these guidelines, and perhaps maybe taking a step backwards, why did you find it useful to invest resources in preparing these guidelines?
Sure. I'll be glad to do that. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be on this distinguished panel, this exciting opportunity. Well, in Japan, public support for revitalization of business entities are provided based on a variety of policy objectives. Public support for revitalization retains enterprises that would otherwise have exited the market as a result of competition. Support may give inefficient enterprises a competitive advantage and interfere with the market mechanism in which inefficient enterprises exit and only efficient enterprises survive. Therefore, it is important, a problem that has been cited repeatedly at this event already, and it is important to minimize the impact of such a problem on competition when providing public support for revitalization. In light of this problem regarding public support for revitalization, the JFTC published the guidelines for public support for revitalization in view of competition policy in March 2016. We're delighted that our guidelines have contributed to the competitive neutrality toolkit, judging from several references within the publication. The guidelines point out that in order to minimize the negative impact caused by public support on competition, such support should complement private sector efforts. The scale of support should be kept to the minimum necessary, and transparency of support should be ensured. Based on these principles, the guidelines also indicate specific elements that should be considered by supporting organizations for public support for revitalization. For example, the guidelines indicate the following considerations to be made for the minimum necessity requirement. First, request the supported entities to procure by themselves loans and capital increments from private financial institutions as much as possible before asking for support. Second, have shareholders fulfill their responsibility by bearing the losses of the supported entities by capital reduction and other similar means. The guidelines also indicate the following principles regarding the period and frequency of support. The period of support should be as short as possible and should not be extended. And public support should be provided on a once-only basis and should not be repeated each time the supported entity faces financial difficulties. Furthermore, the guideline states that even if the impact on competition is minimized through the precise design of support, there may still be unacceptable effects on competition, such as significant competitive advantage for the supported entity. In such cases, the guideline states that remedies should be taken in advance to resolve the problems. According to the guidelines, examples of such remedies include conduct remedies, such as restricting investment in production facilities or new business fields by supported enterprises, and structural remedies, such as transfer of business or production facilities by the supported enterprise. However, with regard to the conduct remedies, the guideline states that those that impose restriction on pricing of the supported business should not be adopted in principle because they have the risk of directly restricting competition in the market. The JFTC developed the guidelines not bounded by the AMA framework to indicate various matters as much as possible to be considered in order to minimize the effect of public support for revitalization on competition from the viewpoint of competition policy. It is expected that public support for the revitalization will be provided in line with the guidelines while taking into account the impact on competition so that beneficiaries will not have a significant competitive advantage by leveraging support for revitalization, which is the focus of the Neutrality Toolkit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reiko. If I may take the opportunity for those of you who are not familiar with the JFTC guidelines to have a look at them. If you're interested in competitive neutrality, this is fascinating reading material. We'll move now to public service obligations. And public service obligations are these obligations which refers to when we have goods or services that are not provided or cannot be provided in the free market. Usually the state intervenes and require or requests a private entity to provide them. Usually at the same time provide also paying some kind of compensation to this firm, and compensation can be too low or, as it is often the case, too high, and which might have implications in terms of competitive neutrality. So Kani, if I may go back to you and ask you maybe to take us a bit deeper into this concept and maybe provide an example in case you have one.
Thank you very much. Yes, I can provide an example which is covered, in fact, in one of our reports that was published in 2018 regarding a public service obligation established between it was a maritime service. It was established between the city of Ceuta in the north of Africa and the south of Spain, Algeciras. At the time, there was an obligation imposed on the three operators of that straight line to provide three trajects a day, but their prices were free. And at the same time, there was a public contract that was going to be tendered in which the authorities wanted to impose maximum prices, service obligations regarding the frequency, and technical conditions on the kind of the ships that were going to be used. The city of Ceuta wanted to assess from a competition point of view whether they were doing things right, and they asked us for our opinion. You have all the elements and all the analysis that we did in that report that is publicly available on our website, but suffice to say that in our study, we started by reminding that these services were already liberalized and therefore only when market was not providing with the right answer to the demand, an intervention was justified. But also our analysis showed that services offered by operators were going further than the binding conditions that were set in the PSO. So we were in fact casting some doubts on whether the necessity of the proportionality of the PSO was really justified there. At the same time, we were giving some recommendations in order to modify both the possibility of the PSO or the public contract by issuing recommendations that are very much in line with the toolkit, like, for example, making sure with an assessment that there was no over or under compensation, making sure in the assessment that if those measures were going to be applied, there were no other less restrictive measures and so on and so forth. But I recommend you, because there are very specific recommendations regarding both the PSO and the public contract service that was going to be issued, because that would provide you with a very detailed possibility of measures. Let me just consecrate one minute to other regulated sectors in which we also oversee public service obligations, as we are as well the regulator in transport and in postal services in Spain. And in these both sectors, we are now overseeing some public service obligations that we are not only making sure that, well, all the elements that you may know, that they are provided by not always the incumbent, but open to competition, that of course they are not in over or under compensation, but we are also analyzing, for example, in the railway sector, whether there are trajects that could be open to competition. We've done that already in several routes, but we are still analyzing that in order to suggest or recommend the government to extract some new trajects that could be open to competition, so to open them really to market conditions. Also, in the public service obligations that are rendered by Renfe, by the incumbent, there is an obligation in 2030 that some 3% of those public service obligations are open to competition. We are trying to convince our government to start already designing the conditions for these public service obligations to be open to the general possibility, as we do have several operators in our market. Last thing on postal, we are also overseeing that the universal postal service, that is a public service obligation as well, that has to be provided in Spain, is done in such a way that the compensation received does not serve to cross-subsidize other services that are in the liberalization, which is also a warranty to have neutrality both in the public service obligation and in the fact that the incumbent is still providing services in the liberalized market. So that's we have followed the methodology that has been revised, going into a cost test analysis, and that is what we are applying. So yeah, lots of areas in which we are following the neutrality toolkit.
Thank you very much. Moving now to the regulatory framework. As we know, regulation is obviously a path in which competitive neutrality can be disrupted, restored, and competition authorities are usually or typically using their advocacy powers to advocate for competitive neutrality. And let me start this conversation, Reiko, by getting back to you. So for competition authorities to convey the message of competition in general, but of competitive neutrality, you sometimes have to be persistent. Things do not necessarily go so easy, and you recently made some recommendations regarding the electricity sector in Japan, and maybe you can share with us some of the thoughts and the conclusions that you have from this process.
Certainly, and demonstrate our persistence. In order to ensure and promote competition neutrality with respect to the regulatory framework, we should monitor the advocacy of the regulation and review them as necessary. The JFTC has actively promoted regulatory reform through advocacy activities, as Zoe mentioned, such as examining regulatory issues from the competition policy perspective, publicly announcing recommendations for regulatory improvements, and conveying recommendations directly to the relevant ministries and agencies. Needless to say, such initiatives are first and foremost relevant to the principles described in Chapter 4 of the Competition Neutrality Toolkit, including that regulation should be competition neutral. For instance, the JFTC has continuously advocated for regulatory reform and competitive neutrality in the electric power sector. In Japan, liberalization of entry into the electricity market has been making progress, starting with the liberalization of entry into the power generation sector and wholesale electricity trading in 1995. In 1997, the JFTC recommended that complete liberalization of the electricity retail market as a long-term goal. And in 2006, it recommended that equal footing between competing companies be given special attention in the design of system for complete liberalization. And in 2012, after conducting a market study, it recommended the separation of the transmission and distribution divisions from the generation, wholesale, and retail divisions of the former regional monopolies, and furthermore, the separation of retail divisions from the generation and wholesale divisions of the monopolies to form a distinct trading entity. In light of these recommendations, entry regulations had been removed in stages in the electricity retail market, and all retail sectors, including residential electricity, were liberalized in 2016. In addition, some former monopolies implemented the separation of the retail divisions from the generation and wholesale divisions. Furthermore, in order to ensure competitive neutrality, in 2020, the power transmission and distribution sectors of the former monopolies had been separated into distinct companies. These recommendations are relevant to the principle regarding the regulatory framework in Chapter 4 of the Toolkit, as well as those in Chapter 7, such as the public service obligations should not be automatically assigned to the incumbent operators. Most recently, we conducted a new market survey on the wholesale electricity trading sector and published a report in January of this year. The purpose of this survey was to understand the current competitive environment and regulatory in the electricity market, taking into account that securing a stable electricity supply has become an issue with calls for decarbonization, and that the new entrants in the retail sector have been exiting one after another amid rising fuel prices, such as that of LNG. The report pointed out that if a fair competitive environment is not realized in the retail market, even with more detailed monitoring of retail rates and other measures suggested in the report, then the former monopolist power generation and wholesale divisions should be separated from its detailed revision to form a distinct trading entity, and that at the same time of separation, monitoring is necessary to ensure that there is no unfair and discriminatory treatment between the former monopolist and new entrants. And at this time, we're still waiting to see what will happen in response to the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It seems that it's a long-term relationship, the ones that you're having with the electricity sector. And we've heard from the EU and from Spain that in certain cases you have a clear regulatory framework, a legal framework for addressing competitive neutrality, but this is not necessarily the case in every country. And my understanding is that indeed in Mexico, Andrea, now I'm turning to you, you do not have a clear law which addresses competitive neutrality. So how do you do that? How do you advocate for competitive neutrality in the absence of a clear legal framework?
First of all, thank you, Ori, and to the OECD for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here remotely, and it's a pleasure to see many of my esteemed colleagues who I will be seeing personally in a few days in Mexico, and I'm very excited about that. So indeed, I think Reiko stated it perfectly in her last intervention. Persistence is key, and strong advocacy. And using a diverse range of advocacy tools. But first, I would just like to say, competition perspective is key and is essential when issuing legislation, policy decisions, etc. However, something that is not a secret, it's not the only policy objective, and I think the toolkit puts it very perfectly on how you have to take into considerations the different policy objectives, what the policy wants to accomplish, how can it accomplish, but in the most competitive, neutral way without favoring any player or creating barriers to entry a certain market, etc. And to that, I really do want to congratulate on the toolkit, because I think it's very useful. And so what do we do as I think Reiko was saying, we are very persistent, and there are many advocacy tools that we can use. First of all, COFECE can issue some non-binding regulatory opinions regarding laws, policies, regulations, and any administrative acts. I will speak about a few examples. And to that extent, we monitor and we talk to regulators constantly to find advocacy opportunities, specifically or mostly in many of our strategic sectors, such as finance, health, energy, transportation, agri-food, and public procurement. We also have a tool, and I will be a little bit more in-depth into this in just a few moments, but it's also important to mention that we have a tool in our website to report regulatory obstacles. This tool has also become very effective and useful, especially because Mexico, we are a federation. We are composed of almost 130 million inhabitants, but 32 states and with a very extensive territory. And so this particular tool has helped us identify some regulation that could be harmful to competition, not only at the federal level, but at the state level. And to this, one of the initiatives that we have launched recently is to have more outreach and more communication and better relations with the states. Because as I mentioned, there can be very harmful federal regulation or national level regulation, but it can also happen, and it's very common to happen, and we've seen a number of cases when the regulation is not neutral in a competitive way from the state level. Additionally, we do have a guide for the evaluation of competition from the perspective of regulation, from the perspective of competition, which was launched by COFECE, and this guide or guideline actually includes many of the principles that are set out in the assessment toolkit. But as I mentioned, one of the most of the tools that we most commonly use are non-binding regulatory opinions. Just to give a few examples, in the financial sector, when a few years ago there was a big legislative change in order to recognize fintechs and to regulate fintechs. And COFECE was very active, and we collaborated and participated with legislators and issued some of the some recommendations to that legislation that were actually adopted. And I would like to focus on fintech, because after the first set of legislation was issued, we then assessed how the market evolved, and then issued a second regulatory opinion, especially identifying some aspects of the regulation and the law that were not creating an equal playing field. Apart from that opinion, which we have worked very closely with the financial regulators to adopt, we are currently, and we are at the final stage of our digital financial services market study. So I think the financial case puts a little bit more. You can see the stages where we can issue regulatory opinions, but if we still see some issues in the market, and the opinion might not be enough, or we need to have a more exhaustive analysis, then we can turn to market studies. I would just like to mention another brief example in which we did not issue a regulatory opinion, but we recently worked very closely with the energy regulator regarding the emission of or the issuing the regulation regarding electric charging stations in Mexico. And this, I think this puts very much into perspective some of the topics that have been addressed before and that were addressed by Fred in the introduction. So in Mexico currently, or not currently because now the regulation was launched, we had no regulation regarding electric charging stations and no standard. And so what we did was work closely with the energy regulator in order to ensure that the regulation would not favor a specific brand or specific type of charger, but at the same time, there were different policy objectives that were put on the table to ensure that a network will be created, which will ultimately benefit consumers. And I think one aspect that, and this is to finish my first intervention, one aspect that I would like to highlight is not only were most of the recommendations that we worked with the regulator adopted, but a specific provision was created in the regulation stating that COFECE and the energy regulator will interchange information and will monitor very closely in order, one, to review the regulation periodically, and second, if there is a competition issue, then we will take that information and COFECE can make use of some of its other powers. So even though there's no explicit law regarding competitive neutrality, COFECE does have a series of advocacy tools that we constantly use in order to ensure neutral markets.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And if I may follow up, you mentioned several examples which I found fascinating. If I'm not mistaken, you recently had a similar, issued wide range of recommendations on the card payment and settlement system market. If you can first say a few words on this case and maybe just also describe the impact of the recommendations that you make. Were you successful actually in promoting competitive neutrality?
Yes, thank you, Ori. And I think this is another example because this is not an advocacy tool. What we did in the card payment system was not an advocacy tool. It was actually a market investigation, which, as you probably know, COFECE, like the CMA and some other new jurisdictions, now has the power to conduct market investigations. Market investigations, or during our market investigations, our findings can be that there are regulatory barriers, or well, that there are barriers to competition in a certain market. And those barriers to competition can come from regulation. It can also come from structural or behavioral barriers related to those participants in the market. And so, yes, we conducted a market investigation. It was a very in-depth and profound market investigation regarding the entire credit card payment system. I should mention that in Mexico, the regulation regarding credit card payment systems was created decades ago. And it was created for the necessity of having a card payment system because it didn't exist. And so the regulation was designed in order to be to have the participants in the market or self-regulate themselves, not to have a strong intervention by the regulators. This and what did it derive, and one of the main aspects that we focused in our investigation was one of the participants of the system, which are clearing houses. I'm not even sure that clearing houses actually exist now in other jurisdictions, but these participants in the markets are basically in charge of making sums or of determining which amount of money or how many transactions were made from the emissions or from the bank emissions of the credit cards, and how were the transactions on the businesses. And so they basically do a balance and determine which banks get to be paid what on balancing all of these operations that are done daily. So this figure of clearinghouses, or however we can put it in English, are, as I mentioned, were created due to the necessity of having a payment system, but in the regulation, they were actually given the power of, for example, determining what are the technical requisites for any other player to enter the market. There is no clear time frame in the regulation to determine how long they have to take to assess the technical qualifications of whoever wants to enter the market or issue certifications, etc. So one of the first findings that we found is that these incumbents had no incentives because they were the ones determining who could enter the market and who could not enter the market. I should mention, actually, that the two main houses in Mexico, or the two main incumbents in Mexico, are actually owned by the biggest banks in Mexico. So all of the incentives were aligned to impede or make it very hard for new players to enter the market. And what do we have now, and what we found in our investigation? Today, we have a very different reality from when the regulation and the system was created just to have, as I mentioned, a credit card payment system. Now we have a series of players, much more players in the market that are entering and that are offering their services. And these incumbents were making it very hard, and due to the regulation, we're making it very hard for other participants to enter. What else did we find? There were two other significant findings. The second findings is actually the commissions, or the bank commissions, for using credit cards in Mexico are 6 times higher than in Europe. That is a lot. And our financial inclusion, when you compare the use of card payment systems in Mexico compared to similar economies, not even Europe, but compared to similar economies such as Brazil, we are way, way, way behind. So what we issued in these recommendations are the regulators have to take control, or have to take control back of establishing at least the minimum technical requisites, clear timelines, and consequences for the incumbents not issuing the necessary certifications. On the other hand, the regulators should review the fees that are actually charged, because the fees are agreed by, and this is something that the regulation authorizes, the fees that are charged for using credit cards is something that's agreed by an association of banks that exist in Mexico. And then secondly, what we did, which these were not recommendations, these were now remedies imposed to the players on the market. We instructed them to have in their boards a compliance officer, and to have a clear compliance program, which we will monitor. So one of the alternatives that was discussed is to separate these clearinghouses. But what we thought, or how we designed the final decision that we reached, is we actually want more players in the market. So we want a competitive, neutral regulation that will allow more players in the market, which will ultimately benefit consumers. And that's why we issued these recommendations and imposed those remedies.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrea. And I think you reminded us of another important principle of competitive neutrality, basically highlighting the danger where an industry is self-regulating itself, when the players regulating themselves together.
Yes.
Moving now to public procurement, another area which is extremely relevant for competitive neutrality, for competition more generally. And I know, Kenny, that the CNMC has been very much involved in public procurement in general. And one of the more kind of interesting, and I would dare say unique areas where you've been very active, is when you issued a guide on in-house procurement and horizontal cooperation agreements. This is when procuring authorities prefer to opt out of the procurement system and do it kind of in-house. And can you share with us maybe some background on this guide and kind of also focus, of course, on the competitive neutrality aspect?
Thank you very much. In fact, this is a chapter inside a wider guide. We've been updating, we have a guide on public procurement in general with recommendations to all the public procurement bodies in order to, through all the phases since the design, through the definition of the objectives, then the issuing of the tender, then how to engage in active demand, and so we are reviewing all of these different steps. Each of them is a different chapter, and the most recent one is related to in-house providing and cooperation agreements, meaning we refer to cooperation agreements. In Spanish, we say convenios. So those are the agreements that are directly signed with an entity that will provide a service without a tendering process. So in this particular case, what we are concerned about and what we are trying to analyze from a competition point of view is which are the downsides and the benefits of going in-house. In principle, there is no impediment for public authorities to engage in this kind of activities, but in the guide, we try to call the attention of those public bodies to the downsides of going in-house instead of tendering the possibility of having more offer provided by different players in the market, because this may result in reduced competitive pressure in the market. This may lead also the public sector to experience supply difficulties in the medium and long term, but not only that, because if at the end this disincentivizes investment, innovation, and productivity improvements in the market, this is going to also provide inefficiency losses to not only for the contracting authorities, but also for the market in general, and this is going to have a perverse impact into the whole economy. So what we were analyzing the guide and trying to recommend is that public procurement bodies, when assessing whether they prefer to go tendering for their needs or trying to engage it in-house with their own public bodies or public state-owned companies, for example, we recommend that the use of this in-house providing must be justified on a case-by-case basis, analyzing very clearly why in this case it is better to provide an in-house than going in an open tender through an ex-ante competition impact assessment as well. And it has to be correctly funded on smart regulation and administration principles. It is evident that if you go directly to an in-house body, you're going to speed up the process and you're going to gain some other elements that could be contrary to the neutrality principle. For example, that these public bodies may have a better access to infrastructure or things like that. So when we are doing the analysis, we are trying to send a clear message on how you really need to assess this in order not to be favoring agents that would, at the end of the day, distort the market. So it is all about maintaining the level playing field between the in-house suppliers and the private enterprises, the undertakings. And we are trying to get to the objective of not generating a new competitive advantage, and in particular to state-owned enterprises when they compete with other operators in open markets in public procurement, because otherwise we may also face problems of cross-subsidization again in activities that are open to the market. I recommend the lecture of the guide with all the recommendations that we are doing, and we are providing also examples there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me now turn again to Marisa. The EU recently adopted regulation on foreign subsidies. It seems that this is a topic which is very much of concern currently to EU policymakers. And as part of this regulation, foreign participants in public procurement processes in Europe needs to provide disclosure and information as part of the procurement process about subsidies that they might have received from the government. And if you can just provide a bit of background on this kind of new regime and the kind of the competitive neutrality rationale behind it?
Thank you. Yes, the foreign subsidies regulation is there to fill a gap because, as I was mentioning before, the member states were subject to very concrete rules from the very beginning about their state aid that they were providing to companies, while non-EU countries, companies that were participating in the market, in the European market, were not subject to the similar scrutiny. And therefore, in order to ensure that the level playing field for everybody that is providing services in Europe or goods, then this has been created. So in the context of public procurement, these foreign subsidies could, as some state aid provided by European governments, provide an unfair advantage to subsidized companies. And this would allow these companies to undercut rivals and therefore to distort competitive neutrality. So the foreign subsidies regulation is building on an extensive enforcement experience and record in other fields, like for instance, state aid and also merger review, because this is in terms of substance, but also in terms of procedures and of powers of enforcement. You will see that when you go through it, some things resemble to the powers that you have under the merger regulation, under the antitrust regulation. Everything we have learned has been somehow instilled into this new regulation. And then it introduces rules to identify subsidies likely to distort the internal market, such as unlimited debt warranties and subsidies to failing companies. And then this is an assessment that is made case by case. It is considering factors, of course, like the size of financial contributions. And then there are a couple of possibilities for getting the review of these subsidies. One, and the normal one, is notification. The other one is without notification, ex officio, if you want to call it like that. So the foreign subsidy regulation establishes a notification requirement for significant EU procurement procedures above 250 million euro. And in that case, bidders must indeed, as you mentioned, disclose the foreign financial contributions received in the past 3 years. And mind you, it is not yet 1 year that this is in force, because it began in the last October, and we have received already over 1,000 submissions. And this had led to 3 in-depth investigations related to EU public procurement. So the Commission can, as well, as I was mentioning, initiate reviews independently, and this we would do even in procedures below the threshold, for instance, based on information from member states or from competitors or from other sources. Interestingly, the Commission conducts this 2-step review, and if after the initial review an in-depth investigation is warranted, like these 3 I was mentioning, the Commission then assesses the impact of the financial contribution on the internal market. And then it makes a balancing exercise. If the negative effects outweigh the positive or beneficial effects, then it can impose measures. And the measures are also known somehow. So it can be certainly prohibiting the whole thing, or imposing commitments, and that can go from divestments, as we know in mergers, from refraining from some investments, and also the possibility of even having to repay the subsidies. So this is the framework.
Thank you very much. Going back maybe to the way competition authorities can intervene in procurement processes, an area that was covered before by Kani. Reiko, if I can turn to you, Japan has been going a process of digitalizing its government as a whole, and the JFTC took a very interesting approach when conducting a market study on this process, focusing also on the public procurement side. And could you share with us some background on this market study, particularly on the recommendations that were relevant for competitive neutrality?
Yes, I'll be happy to. As described in the Competition Neutrality Toolkit, competitive neutrality principles should be reflected not only in the rules on public procurement procedures, but also in their implementation. However, even if the procuring authority intends to conduct competitive neutral procurement, when there is information asymmetry between the procuring agency and the business as a supplier, the procurement procedure may result in favoring certain businesses, contrary to the intention of the procuring authority. This is common occurrence in the procurement of highly specialized products and services. And one such example is information systems, an important part of the digitalization process. The JFTC conducted a market study on information system procurement by government agencies and published the report in February 2022. The result of the survey indicated the so-called vendor lock-in problem might be occurring in the procurement of information systems by government agencies. The report pointed out that it is desirable to reduce the size of the information procurement units and facilitate coordination among systems and to standardize data from the viewpoint of preventing vendor lock-in and promoting new entrants. The report also said that adopting open source software and highly versatile technologies and products is effective to promote the entry of a variety of vendors and avoiding design specifications that favor only certain vendors, thereby preventing vendor lock-in. The report identified that insufficient human resources related to information systems in public offices is one of the factors causing vendor lock-in. It is therefore desirable that necessary institutional design and budgetary measures be implemented to secure and expand personnel with expertise engaged in information systems. In addition, the report identified a situation in procurement procedure of information systems where a vendor may provide inaccurate information, taking advantage of the ignorance of the person in charge of the procurement procedure and putting in place technical specifications that only the vendor can meet, thereby making it difficult for other vendors to participate in bidding, contrary to the government agency's bidding policy. Report states that such conduct may violate the Anti-Monopoly Act. I would also like to add that even if the procuring agency intends to preserve competitive neutrality, contrary to that intention, business operators may attempt to distort the neutrality of the procurement procedure, and such actions may also violate the Anti-Monopoly Act. As a recent example, the JFT investigated a case where IT vendors explained that it was essential for the information security of the website to use the vendor's own content management system, which was not open source software, although this claim was completely unfounded. Their conduct was suspected to violate the Anti-Monopoly Act, and this case was handled under the commitment procedure. The JFTC approved the commitment plan, submitted the vendors, and publicized the result in June 22. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before moving to our last topic, which is the enforcement of competition law, let me just remind you that after this last topic, we'll have the opportunity for Q&A. So those of you here can start thinking about possible questions, and those joining us online can use the chat to suggest questions, and we'll should have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So the last topic is the enforcement of competition law. And of course, this is maybe part of a bigger issue, which is about the equal enforcement of laws and regulation in general. But we in the toolkit focused on competition law, and obviously to ensure that ensure a level playing field, competition law should be enforced in an equitable manner. And Marisa, considering your very recent and very long enforcement experience, let me turn to you and maybe present a more general question about the challenges, of achieving competitive neutrality in competition law enforcement.
Thank you. But I'm going to stay with the Commission remit, I think, because then we would overlap a bit to my right. So, yes, well, you know, EU competition law and in principle competition law that is well designed applies equally to all companies. So it should be impartial and apply to them irrespective of nationality and irrespective of ownership structure, whether it is public, it is private. And then DG Comp also enforces these rules uniformly, impartially. At least that is what we try to do, and that is our endeavor. So that also includes when we are dealing with state-owned enterprises, okay? And then sometimes the issue is asserting jurisdiction, asserting company over, competence over those companies. So let's take the example of state-owned undertakings in merger assessments. So the question is, does this company meet the threshold to fall under the merger control under the control of the merger by in this case the Commission? If you go to our European Union merger regulation, it says the Commission must assess the turnover on all undertakings making up an economic unit with an independent power of decision. And of course, we need to see whether it meets a turnover threshold. So if a state-owned enterprise is not independent from the state, or is not independent from another state-owned undertaking, then the Commission treats this whole body as a single economic unit and therefore aggregates the turnover to determine jurisdiction. There is a case which was the first one in which we had a decision by the Commission concluding on the lack of independence of a Chinese state-owned enterprise. And this is a decision of March 2016, EDF CGN NNB. So CGN stands for China General Nuclear Power Corporation, right? So there the transaction was about the acquisition of joint control by EDP, the French EDP, and this China General Nuclear Power Corporation, CGN, of NNB. And CGN was owned 90% by the Central State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administrative Commission, SASAC, to make it shorter. And this SASAC is one of the main Chinese state-owned companies that is active in the energy sector with a particular focus on nuclear energy, right? So originally, if you would look alone to the turnover of CGN as such, it wouldn't have met the EU thresholds for our supervision. And then it was necessary for the Commission to establish the perimeter of the relevant economic unit for the purpose that I was mentioning before, and then decide whether the transaction had or did not have a EU dimension, and therefore whether it was something that needed to be notified to the European Commission. Okay, so the Commission found that the CGN, as well as other Chinese state-owned companies in the energy sector, were independent nominally, but in reality were subject to the state influence through this central SASAC that I mentioned, and consequently it considered the full turnover of all companies controlled by central SASAC that were active in the energy sector to establish whether they were meeting or not the EU threshold. So this illustrates well, as a first opportunity, how we determine jurisdiction in those cases. I can add that that case was cleared. I mean, it was a decision 6-1B, so non-opposition, but we did scrutinize this merger. And then the other challenge is obtaining as complete a set of information as possible. And then there are three things we use for that. One, of course, is pre-notification that is critical. So there are some quantitative data that sometimes are missing. If that is the case, then the Commission may rely also on qualitative information, such as internal company documents to fill the gaps. And that is not only the Commission who does it. And then Article 11.3 decisions, to request information formally. That is something that can potentially be followed by a stop the clock mechanism or by fines if the parties remain uncooperative. So this is also to incentivize cooperation and obtaining the information. National authorities or EU delegations on the ground may also assist the Commission in this task of gathering information locally. And finally, we have another possibility is that the ex-ante notification system allows the Commission to adopt what we call incompleteness decisions if the notification is incomplete, and then we require the companies to revise their submission before they can receive any clearance to proceed with their transaction. So these are the means we use in order to ensure that we have sufficient information to make the assessment.
Thank you very much. So we have come to the Q&A part of our panel. So let me open the floor. See if there are any questions. Just raise your hand. Do we have questions online? Yes, so please.
Good afternoon. I read some of the questions we got online. First, what are the guidelines regarding rules that privilege small companies or establish priority to companies that comply with sustainability standards in public procurement? So this is the first one. The second one, are there any examples of private enterprises requesting agency attention or action to achieve competitive neutrality?
Okay, maybe we can start with the first one, and if I understand correctly, this is a question about giving preference to SMEs, or alternatively giving preference to companies who adopt kind of greener policies throughout procurement processes. Would you see that as something that undermines competitive neutrality, or do you think that there's no issue here? Yes, please.
Well, I'm going to refer to how small and medium-sized companies should be treated in my view in an economy as the one that, for example, in Spain we have, where 90% or over of our industrial tissue is composed of small and medium-sized companies. In order for a market to work well, we should make sure, as competition authority, that we have a market in which these companies, which is 90% of our market operators, can access the market and can compete in the market. And I'm referring particularly to public procurement, which in Spain, depending on the year, may amount to 18% of our GDP, which is a lot directly, and then all the economic activity that is triggered by public procurement. The situation is that the small and medium-sized companies do not go into tenders. They don't respond to calls for interest in public procurement most of the time. We are extremely worried about that. We don't know, we don't understand why. There is also a report from the Cour des Comptes at the European level that's pointing out to this as well. I mean, the very few number of companies that are responding to public procurement in general, and in particular small and medium-sized companies. And because of this, we've launched a study at the CNMC in order to understand which are the obstacles for small and medium-sized companies to concour to public procurement. We expect, to have the report in 2025 with an idea of establishing recommendations both at the regulatory side, because we have I mean, we already have a public consultation. We've reviewed some of the answers, and one of the elements is pointing at the excess of bureaucracy in the public procurement area, and how small and medium-sized companies could not be on a level playing field in that respect. That could be some of the reasons, or other reasons, but we really would like to end up with some recommendations that could make a level playing field for them in public procurement. As for sustainability, I don't have an opinion here, so I will maybe give the floor to anyone that.
Anyone else would like to comment from the panel here or virtually? Okay. So can you just remind us of the second question?
So whether private companies has reached out to competition authorities asking for actions regarding competitive neutrality.
Okay, so basically, do you get complaints or requests from the general public, from again maybe SMEs or other type of firms which which suffer from the lack of competitive neutrality? And maybe if I can add, do you take action? Would anyone like?
I can comment. Yes, I think my first answer would be yes. Depending on what's going on and which tool we can use, where it can be advocacy or enforcement, but my first answer would be yes. If it's an enforcement issue, which is something that I did not comment before, but we can investigate even if it is a state-owned enterprise when it's not exclusive, and when they have to, or in those cases where they have to comply with competition law, we are able to initiate investigations or advocacy. So my first answer would be yes, but there can be complaints, and it doesn't always have to be regarding state-owned enterprises. But when there is an issue of enforcement, then yes. If it's related to regulation, then also private entities, as I mentioned in my first intervention, can we do have a specific tool in our website to report regulatory barriers. And apart from that, there are many instances where private companies come to us and they report a competitive neutral issue, and because of that issue, then we can take the decision to issue a non-binding regulatory opinion. Or if this is a recurring issue and COFECE does see a problem, then, and it is within our strategic plans, then we can even decide to conduct a market study. So yes, and I would say that there's different varieties of tools depending on what's going on and what's the case.
Thank you. Would anyone like to? Please, Marisa.
Well, of course, I don't think that it is very. Usually, it's not that they say it is against competitive neutrality, but this is already embodied in complaints that we receive, even in the antitrust field, but certainly in the state aid field, and this is also a possibility under the foreign subsidies regulation. So with a different way of naming this, of course, we receive complaints, and eventually we act upon them in all those fields. Yes.
If I may, I will ask you to be very attentive to our website, because I think in the following weeks we will be issuing a decision in which there is a private company that was complaining against a public body that was doing the same economic activity, but claiming that they were the only public body doing that. So for an activity that was an economic activity, so subject to competition rules, prevailing from the fact that they were a public body. But in this particular case, what they were deploying was an economic activity in the private sector. So I cannot explain more about this because it is under deliberation, but in fact, we are tackling the issue not only through an article equivalent to 101, because there is a decision by an association of undertakings, but also under our Article 3, which is equivalent to the FTC 5, unfair methods of competition, because of unfair competition as well, because of the let's say of the publicity that they were, or the privilege that they were claiming in being a public body, which was not relevant here. Okay, so I think it may be a very illustrative example, but to be continued.
I'm curious, so stay tuned to the CNMC website. So we are almost out of time. So let me use what we have to just thank very, very much Reiko, Andrea, Marisa, and Kani for joining us today. We'll now have a 10 minutes coffee break and we'll reconvene at 3:05. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And congratulations, Marissa, on your appointment.
Bye-bye, Reiko and Andrea. Bye.
Nice to see you, everybody. Thanks, sorry.
So welcome back, everybody, and to this second panel, which is going to focus on the perspectives of other policy communities. My name's Julia Nielsen. I'm the Deputy Director of Trade and Agriculture Director here at the OECD, and it's my pleasure to be moderating this distinguished panel today. So, I mean, this is one of the strengths of the OECD. Is one of the things that we do as an organisation is bring different policy communities together to learn from each other, to exchange views, to solve problems across some of the silos. And one of the things that struck me, especially listening to the discussion before and reading the Competitive Neutrality Toolkit, is that competition really is at the heart of many of the other policy areas you're going to hear from this afternoon. And from my own area in trade, competition is what we expect to be one of the main gains from trade. And equally, I think that colleagues who can speak within regulation and also looking at privatisation and state-owned enterprises, the competition is a top draw concern in those areas too. So for us, the Competitive Neutrality Toolkit is an extremely useful and valuable product. And actually, as I look at it, I see lots of commonalities for the policy areas that we deal with, lots of the same concepts. But at the same time, I think to use a metaphor we sometimes use in English, we're all grabbing different parts of the elephant, of the competition elephant. So from a trade perspective, there were many words that I recognize, concept like transparent, concept like non-discrimination, or not more than necessary to achieve the objective. But I also saw some differences, sometimes in emphasis, sometimes in tools, and sometimes in concepts where there are things which are very much contested in the international sphere. And so one example of that would be extending support in order to increase competition in a market, which may be used more domestically, but internationally is still the subject of quite a lot of debate. So in all our policy communities that you'll hear from this afternoon, we're all serving multiple purposes. We have different priorities and multiple agendas. We're also all grappling with the fact that what used to be domestic is now international, and what used to be international is now domestic. And what I mean by that is policy areas that used to be more domestic in focus, from regulation, competition, state-owned enterprises, are now increasingly really at the forefront of some of the issues in international markets. And for those of us who've worked in the trade community, we now realise that the biggest issues on the trade policy agenda actually relate and sit squarely in the domestic policy toolkit. So this is a new challenge for government policy making. It's a new challenge to ensure coherence, but it's also an opportunity, and it's an opportunity to learn from each other and to make better policies. So it's against this background that I'm delighted to have the panel this afternoon, because it brings together people who are really at the core of this interface, and for all of whom competitive neutrality matters, but in different contexts and perhaps in different ways, which we'll hear about this afternoon. So let me just briefly introduce the panel. Immediately to my left is Benedicta Fleischer. Benedicta is the chair of the OECD Trade Committee. And then to her left is Kimmo Vietola, who is the Vice Chair of the OECD Working Party on State Ownership and Privatisation Practices. And at the end of the podium is Professor Alberto Heimler, and he's the Chair of the OECD Working Party on Competition and Regulation. So before I turn to our esteemed panelists, a few words of housekeeping. We will start with an opportunity for each of our panelists to give an opening statement to really explain essentially why they're here, why this matters for their policy community and the issues that they see. After that, I'm going to open the floor for questions. For those of you who are in the room, please feel free to raise your hand. We have microphones. For those online, please put questions into the chat and we will take those as well. I will maintain the moderator's privilege of also having some questions for the panelists. But without further ado, let me first turn to Benedicta Fleischer, Chair of the Trade Committee. Benedicta, over to you.
Thank you, Julia. There's going to be quite a lot of repetition from what you've heard, both from Julia and from the panel before. But that's not a bad sign. It means that the communities are closing in on each other. You're narrowing down the field. Historically, for the Trade Committee, for the OECD, keeping trade open and predictable has been at the core of our work. Trade embodies competition across borders. The trade principles of non-discrimination, most favored nation, and national treatment have everything to do with fair competition and, in today's jargon, competitive neutrality. But when targeting the unlevel playing field, what the trade community does, we have our acquis is not so much the acquis at the OECD, but it's the acquis at the WTO, at the World Trade Organization. And there we have an agreement on subsidies. We have an agreement on anti-dumping. We have provisions in various agreements on monopolies, on exclusive service suppliers, on state trading, on local content requirements. So we have a mixture of competition issues in there, but those have proved not to be enough. And I'd like to go back even 30 years, more than your 20 years, Professor Jennings, in saying that we have tried to get in the 90s a trade and competition discussion going properly. It didn't work. It didn't fly. It didn't fly because for some, this was domestic policy. For others, it was developed countries' priorities over developing countries. So it was, and for many developed countries, there was a lukewarm reaction. We weren't ready to have that one. What has changed with globalization is, like Julia just said, what many countries do domestically increasingly affects other countries. If you have sound competition policies at home, less of a problem for trade. If you don't have good domestic competition policy and good implementation of it, including bankruptcy laws, non-preferential treatment of SOEs, strict transparency requirements and requirements for subsidies, this can and does affect trading partners negatively, both bilaterally in my market or in your market, but also in third country markets where we meet, our companies meet each other there. All the areas covered in the toolkit have trade aspects, but the Trade Committee has had a particular focus on state support in its many forms for the last 7 years. And we focused on level playing field, which again has as at its core the principle of competitive neutrality. We have gone sector by sector, collecting evidence on state support received by large industrial companies and on the impact on trade through the global value chains. Several reports have been published quantifying subsidies in specific sectors: aluminum, semiconductors, rolling stock, to mention just a few, as well as specific types of subsidies that we weren't as aware of as we are now, mentioning particularly below market finance and below market energy inputs across several industrial sectors. This has been turned into a database, which we call MAGIC, which has more than 450 large industrial groups and subsidies they have received for over a period of years from 2005 to 2022. And wherever applicable, across 15 industrial sectors. For the majority of sectors included in the database, the companies covered account for 2/3 or more of global sales or capacity. So even if 450, 480 sounds like a small number, it actually isn't. A synthesis report, Government Support in Industrial Sectors, which is also referenced in the toolkit, was published in 2023 with some overarching findings, which I would like to mention and which have, been directly or indirectly mentioned already. Different industrial sectors attract different types of support that reflect their characteristics. Heavy industry and renewable energy equipment tend to attract more grants and below market borrowings. Tax concessions are relatively larger in tech-oriented sectors and solar PV panels. Below market equity returns occurs mainly in high-tech sectors. Firms based in China obtain disproportionately more support. Below market energy inputs are relatively larger in the Gulf states and GCC countries, Argentina and Russia. Firms in which governments hold more than 25% of the shares tend to receive relatively more support. And the effects of subsidies in a world of global value chains can be very, very complex. And so to the policy perspective, that was the evidence that we've been getting from the analysis. And on the policy perspective, some subsidies, yes, are necessary, but design matters. And the OECD work would suggest that government support needs to be, again, this has been mentioned already, time limited, for example, with sunset clauses, targeted towards those that most need it in order to minimize windfall effects, transparent through the publication of relevant information by the government concerned, proportional with the scale of the problem it is meant to solve, for example, market failures, and non-discriminatory on the basis of local content or the nationality of the parent company. This work will continue, and we will continue to get more evidence. But of course, the next part will be the policy perspective and how do we tackle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benedicta. And I think this is, as many of you will have seen from the press and also some of the discussion in the last panel related to the foreign subsidies regulation in the EU. This is a growing concern of trade policymakers. And I was struck as I looked at the Competitive Neutrality Toolkit about the checklists in there, which I think are quite useful as well from the trade community, notably also the section on looking for alternatives, because often when we talk about design of support, we're also thinking, how can you achieve that objective in a less distorting way? And I thought there's some very useful lessons there. Well, one of the other policy areas that is also top of everyone's mind nowadays is the growing role of state-owned enterprises in the global economy, which have become very important in terms of the number of sectors where government-invested firms play an important role, but also in terms of the increasingly international role played by state-owned enterprises. So it's a great pleasure for me now to turn to Kimmo Vietola, who is the Vice Chair of the OECD Working Party on State Ownership and Privatisation Practices. Over to you.
Thank you, Julia. Good morning, afternoon and evening, everyone. I'm Kimmo Vietola from the Finnish Ownership Steering Department and also serving as a Vice Chair of the OECD Working Party on State-Owned and Privatization Practices. The overarching objectives of the Working Party on State Ownership and Privatization Practices are to initiate and promote policy dialogue and information exchange among member and partner countries, with the purpose of improving corporate governance and integrity of state-owned enterprises, SOEs, and practices for implementing privatization policies. Also, we contribute to professionalizing state ownership, maintaining global level playing field, upholding high standards of integrity and business conduct in SOEs, and fostering their sustainability and resilience. We have just released the OECD guidelines on corporate governance on SOEs, and chapter 3 in this publication especially is promoting the SOE guidelines, which are referring to how to maintain the level playing field. And these guidelines provide recommendations to help ensure fair competition in the marketplace by addressing the treatment of SOEs which engage in economic activities. And as Julia pointed out, these considerations are crucial given the growing importance of SOEs in the global economy. In recent years, however, there have been rising concerns about the market distortions caused by different forms of subsidies and government support to firms, which have been documented by various OECD studies referred here earlier as well. According to the forthcoming 2024 edition of the OECD Compendium on Ownership and Corporate Governance of SOEs, almost 40% of surveyed OECD member and partner jurisdictions allow some SOEs to be subject to special tax treatment, and more than 70% of those jurisdictions allow preferential access to finance for SOEs, including implicit or explicit state guarantees on commercial debt. In response to these evolving challenges and concerns, the SOE guidelines were revised in 2024 with new provisions to further help maintain global playing field, which are fully in line with those of the OECD Competitive Neutrality Toolkit. So these two documents are very well interlinked. And now the SOE guidelines especially recommend that the SOEs would have enhanced transparency, both in public policy and commercial activities, and discourage the use of the SOEs subsidize or grant advantages to other commercial undertakings. The guidelines also broaden the scope of practices favoring SOEs and extend the applicability of competitive neutrality to prevent discrimination. Further, the guidelines emphasize the commercial considerations of SOEs operating in the marketplace and acknowledge policymaking as a factor impacting the level playing field, which should be kept separately. Finally, the revisions clarify the guidelines' applicability to entire SOE portfolio, irrespective of the legal or corporate forms. Overall, these changes aim to collectively enhance transparency and ensure fair competition and context of the SOE governance. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you. And for those interested in international competition issues, I can commend the revised guidelines to you, because they are a very interesting example of how you deal with the new generation of state-invested companies, where it may or may not necessarily be just ownership share that dictates whether a company is really acting commercially or whether it's acting more as an arm of the state. And these are complicated times, so this is a terrific achievement by the Working Party. Let me turn to our final panelist, who's Professor Alberto Heimler, the chair of the OECD Working Party on Competition and Regulation. Professor, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Julia. The Working Party on Competition and Regulation has been the body that actually developed the Competitive Neutrality Toolkit, and also the complementary toolkit, which is the Competition Assessment Toolkit. And I would just like to mention the importance of the framework that we developed, because recommendations are not sufficient to address practical policy implications of our member states and non-member states as well, because recommendations are very general usually, and cannot really address the practicality of their implementation. And this is why already in 2009 we decided to complement the recommendation with toolkits. And the toolkit is meant to explain the recommendation in a practical way, so as to make sure that countries and administrations, governments that are in the process of implementing the recommendations have examples and approaches that they can rely on, and they can address the practical aspect of their actual activity that they are doing. Furthermore, the fact that we have a toolkit makes the instrument very flexible, because the toolkit is not a council of recommendation, and as such is much easier to change and to also enrich. And just to give you an example, the competition assessment toolkit started as a single manual, and in the course of the year, it has developed into 3 manuals, one on principle, another one on guidance, a third one on the operational implementation, so that toolkit is a very important addition to the recommendation. And as such, I think it should represent a best practice also for the OECD at large, because very often these recommendations are too general to be implemented, and the toolkit is a way to make it more up to the task that a recommendation is aims at achieving. So this is why also with the Competitive Neutrality Toolkit, we decided to, in fact, issue it and to complement it to the recommendation itself. And the toolkit also, as Frédéric Geny said in his presentation, is a complementary instrument to the competition assessment toolkit. So the objective of the competition assessment toolkit is to identify regulations that are justified according to the objectives that they are aimed of achieving, and making sure that that objective is achieved in the least competitively distorted way possible. And the competitive neutrality toolkit makes sure that any regulation or any support is implemented without discriminating in an unjustified way among different companies. So the competition neutrality toolkit is a complementary instrument to the competition assessment toolkit. And as Frédéric was saying, there are 2 ways of which competitive neutrality does exist, and we heard it in the past panel, that is discrimination in the law and discrimination in the enforcement of the law. And of course, discrimination in the law is easier to address because you just have to look at the law and see whether the law is discriminating. However, discriminating in enforcement, it's much more difficult. And we heard before from Cani Fernandez some examples. Other examples are very easy to identify, and that is allow the possibility of challenging decision-making processes in court. This is a way of addressing issues associated with discrimination in enforcement. And of course, as Kani was mentioning with respect to in-house providing in procurement, also issuing guidelines to make sure that such discrimination does not occur, because very often challenges in court are not possible. And for example, in antitrust enforcement, they are possible. If a case is not being properly addressed by a competition authority because a state-owned enterprise is involved, competitors or suppliers or buyers can address such decision in court and challenge it in court, making sure that competitive neutrality is assured in enforcement. Of course, challenges in court are unable to address competitive neutrality issues associated with the law itself. And this is where the competitive neutrality toolkit and the competition assessment toolkit comes in. Just to give you an idea of the importance of this instrument, I just would like to refer to the recently issued Draghi report, which aims at improving productivity growth in Europe. And its first recommendation is to complete the internal market within the European Union. And the internal market is a market where the free circulation of goods, services, and capital is assured within the European Union. And of course, one of the main instruments for achieving the completion of the internal market is competitive neutrality. Of course, the internal market goes much beyond competitive neutrality. There is mutual recognition, for example, so that Draghi does not really simply refers to competitive neutrality, but of course, competitive neutrality is a very important element of the internal market, and as such, all the experiences that Marisa before mentioned on state aid, which is certainly part of the recommendation on competitive neutrality, are important examples that could be used also by non-EU members to address distortion created by state aid. But the internal market, of course, goes beyond state aid issues. It goes also into the regulatory instructions and makes sure and prohibits indeed any discrimination based on nationality or on the legal form of firms. So it goes very much in the direction of what we are trying to achieve with competitive neutrality. As all OECD instruments, competitive neutrality is also addressed, of course, to member countries, but also to non-members, especially, I believe, candidate countries, because it is in developing countries and also in candidate countries, so developing countries that have recently achieved the status of being able to become OECD members. And the competitive neutrality toolkit is quite important for making sure that the regulations is respectful of the principles of competition and to make sure that there are no discrimination with respect of how support or any regulation is being implemented. And together with competition assessment, that make sure that regulation is not unjustifiably restrictive. It ensures of course, productivity growth, income growth, and general welfare to be improved. What is the purpose of the toolkit? The purpose of the toolkit is to make sure that administrations, and especially government administration, of course, but also administrations at all levels of government, when they issue a regulation, have the toolkit in front of them, both the competitive neutrality toolkit and the competition assessment toolkit. That is the purpose of our work. It's not so much that these toolkits remain in the hands of antitrust authorities, because antitrust authorities do not issue regulation, do not address government policy, and are not involved directly in public policy decisions. So our purpose is to make sure that governments at all levels, of course, have at their disposals these documents just from the start. And why is it important that they have it at their disposal just at the start? It is important because options any policy objective can be achieved by different policy initiatives. And the toolkit, these two toolkits, competitive neutrality and competition assessment, make sure that these objectives are achieved in a less competitive, in the less distortive of competition possible way. And as a result, it's very important that the toolkit is being used from the start of a legislative process or a regulatory intervention, not at the end of the process. Because when this happens, that competition assessment or competitive neutrality is addressed at the end of the process, it is simply a ticking of the box exercise, and very seldom it's able to achieve the results that we are aiming, that is to make sure that regulation is as less distortive of competition as possible. So it's important that the toolkit is being in the hands of government officials from the start, and that the large OECD community is aware of the existence of these tools. And this is why the OECD has organized this event today with all the communities present here, so to make sure that there is an awareness of the existence of this tool. And as such, I think that the widespread use of the toolkit could be advanced by antitrust authorities in their advocacy function. It has happened in the past with a competition assessment. Italy has done so, Japan has done so, Spain has done so to make available OECD results domestically so as to make aware public administration and governments that in their own government of the existence of these very important instruments. And I hope that the same could happen with the Competitive Neutrality Toolkit.
Thank you very much, Professor. I can only echo that one of the things I noticed when I read it, which is particularly useful for non-competition policy people, is that very practical aspect. It has examples, it has checklists, it's a very step-by-step way of also getting at things that's more familiar to us in the trade community, which is something that looks on the face of it to be non-discriminatory, but actually is discriminatory and helps you step by step think through that. And I particularly like the fact that it's designed to prevent the problems rather than address them and to use upfront. But you raised an important point at the end, which is the awareness of communities that this terrific tool is out there. So I'm going to ask the three of you now to contribute to that advocacy effort while I have people around the floor thinking of their questions, which is I'm going to put you in an elevator. And in that elevator are all the key people in your policy community. And you're on I'm going to give you the 10th floor, maybe the 12th. And you've got until the ground floor to tell me, to tell everybody in that elevator, why is this toolkit so important for them, and what is the thing that you would really say in the toolkit is most important for them, and why this matters. I'm going to start with the trade community, which if it's in an elevator and isn't scratching and clawing at each other, we can first, Benedicta, over to you.
Well, the toolkit, it points to only proceed with a measure when not possible to identify a less trade distorting measure to achieve the same goal. And that is, it's a basic mantra that I have with me the whole time, which is not more trade restrictive than necessary, not more trade restrictive than necessary. And this toolkit has this incorporated. And I would like to say that I agree with Alberto that, you have to do it at the start, not at the end. So when we just think about industrial policy, am I on the ground floor now?
I'm going to give you a couple of extra floors because I'm liking them.
When we think about industrial policy and the effects it has on trade, start thinking about it immediately and not at the end. Extremely important, and that it should not be more trade restrictive than necessary. Thank you.
Excellent. That was worth taking you to the car park for. Kimmo, over to you.
Thank you. I would combine the toolkit and the SOE guidelines, and I would see that ensuring the competitive neutrality requires multidisciplinary approach. And therefore, it's important that one is looking both the guidelines and the toolkit together from the SOE point of view. And therefore, I think that it's important that both of these documents provide a comprehensive framework to enhance transparency, accountability, and efficiency of SOEs. And therefore, the toolkit and the guidelines give a good sort of reference point. And I think with what Alberto said, that you should use them in the beginning, not in the middle or at the end. Of course, you can do the tick in the boxes when you've done it, but I think it's also important when one is looking at SOEs that one is keeping the policy and the ownership functions different. So therefore, the toolkit also is giving room for the policymakers to look for the competitiveness. Thank you.
Perfect, and that's a nice. From my floor, I got off several floors early. Transparency, accountability, and efficiency of SOEs. So, Alberto, I'm sure you've done this before. Over to you.
No, I already said a few things, but I think Fred before mentioned industrial policy, and we all discuss industrial policy, unfortunately, in my view, because Italy has, I come from Italy, and Italy has had very bad experiences with industrial policy and in the past. And I think also we will have in the future, but we don't know the future, certainly in the past. And what was the bad experience? The bad experience was particularly the fact that we, with industrial policy, tried to keep alive industries that didn't have any future and did not even have any present. So this was the problem of industrial policy, and also the fact that governments don't seldom, or at least I don't want to be too radical, but seldom have an idea of what will be the future advantages that entrepreneurs may achieve. What will be the future sectors or the future products. So industrial policy in this sense, Draghi, since we speak about Draghi, he suggests that subsidies should be sector-oriented. Now, I disagree with this, just to give you an idea, because a sector is comprised of firms at different level of the technology. A sector is not an homogeneous issue. It's not a market sector. And as a result, even though you concentrate the subsidies on sectors, you are not sure at all that you will subsidize the most effective or the most the industry that deserves it the most. You may subsidize the least effective or the least efficient industry. I did research. Am I too long? Because the elevator goes fast.
It's stuck, so you're okay.
Can I continue? I did research in the past on industrial sectors productivity, and there are traditional sectors where you have very high productivity companies in clothing, in shoes, manufacturing, in furniture. So you don't need to be in semiconductors to be technologically advanced. So it's very difficult, or you may be in semiconductors and not be at all technologically advanced. So sector-oriented subsidies are not a medicine for efficiency. And I think the Competitive Neutrality Toolkit allows you to identify those deficiencies and make sure that subsidies really address market failures and not really try to identify the industrial structure of the future.
Thank you. And I think some of the, it's interesting, as you were speaking, I was thinking some of the work that has been done under the Trade Committee does actually show that when we look at industrial sectors, that the more support actually tends to go to the less productive firms. Interesting. So, you know, it's those and as well as was mentioned in the opening remarks, as well as state-owned enterprises. So we find that firms with 25% or more state ownership receive more grants, and they receive more cheap loans than other firms. They're also important providers of it. Do I have any questions from the floor at this stage? If not, having asked you to be advocates, I'm now going to ask you to reflect on the challenges and what's the biggest challenge of trying to apply. So we've all been talking about this is a really important principle. We've got a fantastic toolkit. This is really good. We all agree that competitive neutrality is really a major issue. What are the challenges in terms of applying this? And maybe I can start this time with you, Kimmo, and then I'll turn to Benedicta.
Thank you. The biggest challenges, in my view, is the definitional issues of SOEs. especially with reference to the competitive neutrality as well as the guidelines, because there is no universal definition of SOE, and this makes it hard to measure the exact share of the SOEs in the global marketplace and to come up with relevant policy measures across policy communities in the various fora. I'm proud to say that the revised SOE guidelines adopted earlier this year, they have significantly strengthened the definition aspect to provide further clarity on the applicability of the guidelines. The guidelines apply to SOEs that are owned and or controlled by the state, either through direct majority ownership, where the state is the ultimate beneficiary owner of voting rights, or where the state exercises decisive influence. This definition was reached by consensus, and the Working Party considers it to be quite comprehensive to cover various situations where the state ownership matters from a corporate governance perspective. Also, we see that the guidelines and many countries, such as my own, place great importance on robust ownership and corporate governance frameworks as means to clarify decision-making and ensure accountability. Harmonizing the definitions, identifying better metrics to capture the weight of SOEs in the global economy would be helpful to build better further evidence and devise relevant policy measures.
Thank you. I can only agree. And Benedicta, challenges for you.
Politics. Basically politics. You have the growing inclination that we've been talking about, of government through its industrial policy to pick sectors, to pick companies, to pick what they think might be winners. Batteries is a case in point that we're seeing today. It might be necessary, but the pitfall is making the wrong choices and throwing taxpayers' money out the window. And so we need the guardrails. And I mentioned some from the trade community on, it has to be transparent enough, it has to be proportional, it has to be targeted and non-discriminatory and so forth. But again, the toolkit, I think going back to the toolkit, if there is a willingness to use it, there you also have some of those guardrails that are necessary.
Thank you. I'm not quite sure how we overcome some of the political challenges, but I think the contribution that the OECD always tries to make is to inform those political debates with good, solid, objective analytical tools, such as the toolkit, to see if we can help inform those discussions. We're not elected, governments are, but we hope to sort of provide them with the tools to make better decisions. Alberto, what do you see as the challenge?
Well, I agree with Benedict about politics. And indeed, the toolkit has an exception, a very important exception. That is, if there are important public interest objectives, then competitive neutrality could be not pursued. And the problem is how to define these public interest objectives, how to define them precisely, because one way politics or government use to identify these public interest objectives is by using broad categories: national defense, security, and R&D. So these are very broad categories, and under them you can also justify policies that are not really justified under a competition perspective or even under a public interest perspective, because they are too broad. So the big challenge is to identify in a proper way, in a more specific and precise way, what these public interest objectives are, and how to make sure that they're not extended too much. So politics, I completely agree.
Yeah, it's interesting because when we look at government support, as we do in my directorate across agriculture, fisheries, fossil fuels, and industrial sectors, one of the things that we always look at is the objective, but also the design and impact. Because I guess after we look at subsidies across sectors, we realize that nobody ever says, this is my re-election subsidy. You know, this is my subsidy because I'm frightened of the agricultural lobby. There's always a really noble reason for a subsidy, which is why what I really liked in this was looking at impact of not just what's it say it's trying to do, but how close is it going to get to actually doing that. But let me turn to a challenge that a number of you have touched on already, which is that this has been developed here in the OECD, and it's excellent, and there's a lot of buy-in from OECD members. But how do we make this more global? How do we encourage more countries, especially developing countries, to use the toolkit and to be on board with the concept? You know, Benedicta, you mentioned that, you know, in the WTO, there was an attempt to have a discussion on trade and competition previously that didn't go along. And I think, Alberto, you also mentioned the importance that this toolkit is for everybody. Can I ask you, everyone on the panel, to reflect on what do we need to do? What can we do to encourage greater use of this by developing countries? Benedicta, I'll start with you.
I mentioned that the WTO was sort of the rule-making body on the trade side. And we haven't been very good in evolving, getting new trade rules for the last few years. And there has been a discussion informally, you know, that even if you don't have trade rules that are specific, very specific commitments that you have to abide by, and might go to dispute settlement if you don't. What about guidelines? What about softer law versus the harder law of the rules in the WTO? And so, you know, I would suggest the toolkit is a guideline. I think it has many trade aspects, important trade aspects. So what would be more natural than to take it to those organizations that do work with trade, whether it is the World Bank, whether it is UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, whether it is the WTO, and present it there as not something that is going to be, put down as this you have to follow, this is the rule, but rather this is actually something you might be interested in because it might help your competitivity in world trade and domestically. So I would say bring it out to those in a targeted manner.
Alberto, does that resonate with you? Are these things that you're doing?
Right. I fully agree. And in fact, it can be used in technical assistance in general. And of course, if other organizations would do the same, it would be even better. But certainly already the OECD does technical assistance with non-member countries. And of course, the Competitive Neutrality Toolkit and the Competition Assessment Toolkit, I don't want to split them because they are part of the same process, of the same regulatory or legislative initiatives. So they cannot be split. And they too can be very important in technical assistance and of course for candidate countries, because candidate countries have to adopt all OECD recommendations. And we have the recommendation on competitive neutrality, we have the recommendation on competition assessment, and they have to comply with those. So candidate countries, of course, will have to comply with those principles.
And Kimmo, what's your view?
I would echo what my fellow panelists have said, that we have the 60 partner economies in the SOE and working party on the, when we have prepared the guidelines earlier this year, and therefore we have had a regional roundtables of SOEs and in Asia and Latin America. So therefore it would be good to combine these elements to the toolkit as well. And also bearing in mind that we are doing the country reviews, where we constantly review the practices and how they have implemented the policies, as well as with the accession processes, So this would be helpful in the toolkit to be recorded and noted there as well. So I think that this multifaceted approach would be helpful.
Great, and I hope today that that those listening to this conversation also, this is a way of inspiring you to think and look at this. I have a very shy audience today, or maybe it's that coveted mid-afternoon spot, but I do have two questions. I'll start with Professor Jani, please, and then, all right, Professor.
Sorry. I just wanted to react to the part of the discussion we just had on what are the challenges, and I preface this by saying that I think it's an extremely valuable piece of work by OECD. But it seems to me that one dimension of competitive neutrality, which we should be aware of, is the weight of history. It is the fact that it is not, in other words, competitive neutrality is not only a question, unfortunately, of what we do today or the policy option. And as I was listening to you, I was reminding myself of the debate that came when the Alstom-Siemens merger was being discussed. And where there were two discourses. One of them was to say, there is not neutrality because CNNC is heavily subsidized and therefore it should be, I mean, it is in some way an unfair competition. And on the other side, there was the idea that there was no way in the world that CNNC would be a winning bid in any of the European public procurement, because the regulations and rules that apply to railways in Europe, which have been constructed by the Europeans, are so different from anything that they are used to that they would not be able to overcome this difficulty. And so I'm not taking side, and I'm not saying that one side was right or wrong, but one of the side was referring to the weight of history as introducing a non-neutrality, which is very hard to tackle. So I think that the OECD toolkit that we have does a very good job at preventing anti-neutrality policies today. And this is certainly a good beginning. Maybe it would be interesting to develop the concept in a more historical perspective.
Thank you. And before asking the panelists to react to that, I saw another question from Urshwat.
Thank you. In one of your previous questions, Julia, you asked the panelists about the importance of the toolkit to developing countries. And I just wonder, is it this toolkit might be relevant in different ways for developing countries? Is it more relevant for developing countries? Considering some of the things that you've said, maybe Benedicta mentioned politics, perhaps it is just as important for developing countries today as it is to develop.
Okay, and the third one, Antonio.
In a way, I think it's all around the same themes, which relates to the challenges and who we should bring this to. But actually, my question, because there was this idea, how can we bring this to developing countries and actually make it more global? And my question is how to guarantee that it sticks in our own countries as well. Because what we see is that not everyone is following competitive neutrality principles around the world, which leads our own policymakers to question whether we should be following such strict recommendations. And of course, again, as Professor Jenny said, I think that this toolkit is extremely valuable. It is exactly what we needed to operationalize the recommendation on competitive neutrality. It is flexible, as Alberto said, we can add in more ways of doing it. But the question is, how do we make our own policymakers, if they look around and they see that others are not following competitive neutrality principles, that this is actually the way to proceed? And it's really relates, it's competitive neutrality at the domestic level that will then affect trade And it's not just trade against a certain bloc, but it's also trade amongst ourselves, amongst our own bloc.
Okay, so three easy questions there that relate to, and I think go to the heart of actually the some of the big policy challenges that we're wrestling with globally. So the historical situation we find ourselves in of non-neutrality, that's quite important in a number of areas. Is it more relevant for developing countries? And if so, how? And how to ensure it sticks within our own country? So maybe I'll turn to you. I'll go left to right this time. So from you, Alberto, first, please.
On the history side, I tend to agree with Fred. I remember when we had the opportunity to expand, to enlarge competition in railway services across Europe. And differently from, this is a very simple example, but it goes in that direction. Differently from aviation, in rail, regulations are written in the language of the country where the train goes through. So at the border of between France and Italy, everybody had to change. They couldn't use the same conductor, driver. I don't know how you call it in English. I think driver is fine because he didn't know. He was Italian. He didn't know French, so he couldn't relate to the French instruction. So you could liberalize the market as much as you want and say everything is free. You can go, but then, if you stick with this restrictive regulation and you use a language that nobody speaks, Czech or German or Italian or French or Danish and every other language, of course you have to rely with two people that speak the language. It is very, and the free movement cannot be expanded. So how to do it? To address those issues first, or to address them in turn. I think the regulatory restrictions are widespread, not just for new regulations, but also for regulations that have existed for decades, and sometimes even for centuries. So it's a very big, extremely big challenge, and it's a work that the sooner we start, the better. Would be my response. As for the fact that some countries adopt non-competitive neutrality decisions, how to address our countries, or the other way around, how to make sure that our politicians do not find those examples as something to pursue, how to contrast. Well, it goes back to what I was saying before. I think that is that the public interest objectives has to be well defined, because if you use security, strategic interest, defense as a very broad term that you can use easily to justify everything, then of course it's very difficult to stop those the examples, so to avoid that our politicians follow those examples. If instead you identify it in a very strict and very precise way, then it's easier. Just to provide an antitrust example, in Germany, mergers can be challenged by the ministry for public interest considerations. And while the decision of the Bundeskartellamt to block a merger is very detailed and gives all sorts of very detailed explanation of why the merger should be blocked, then the minister comes and uses very broad categories to say that instead the merger should be approved. So the public interest considerations should also be subject to the same rigor that we use in antitrust. And this is the way forward. Otherwise, of course, you can, it's very difficult, as you said.
Thank you, Kimmo.
Thank you. There were 3 questions, and I would like to come to those questions from 3 different points, especially concerning the SOEs. And one of them is unequal regulatory treatment, as Alberto was here referring to as well, is one of the main obstacles to maintain level playing field. And in many countries, SOEs often benefit from preferential treatments such as regulatory exemptions or exclusive rights, which gives them a distinct advantage over the private competitors. And this is also applicable to be considered in the home and away, I mean, in your current OECD countries and in developing countries as well, because we know that the application of laws and regulations can also be inconsistent, which SOEs sometimes facing more lenient enforcement compared to the private firms, leading to disparities in operational costs and compliance burdens. And the other is access to certain advantages, which is another concern from the SOE point of view when one is looking at the competitive toolkit, because some of the SOEs may benefit from direct or indirect subsidies or favorable loans or guarantees. And this is distorting the level playing field. And third is the transparency and accountability, which I referred earlier on as well, is that the SOEs can in sometimes operate with less transparency than their private counterparts, which should be taken into consideration and requiring more transparency from SOEs.
I was grappling with the question, is it more relevant for developing countries? Developing countries, the discussion today on the trade side has two sides to it. The one is the whole issue of industrial policy, which one can read as we want to protect as much as we can. It could mean higher tariff barriers again, or in other ways. But the question to pose is always, okay, you want industrial policy too, but you do want to be transparent about it, don't you? I mean, you're not planning to go against your commitments. No, we're not planning to go against our commitments. So the transparency part of this is extremely important to follow through on that in all discussions on industrial policy. And there, of course, in the toolkit, you have that transparency bit. Another part of the industrial policy discussion is, of course, what was mentioned here about productivity and increasing your productivity, and ways of making sure that you're not doing something which actually decreases it. And again, you have parts of the toolkit are useful in that respect. Then you have the fear, and this is the other side of it, in fear of increasing trade-related restrictions by their trading partners, us. And that's when we get into those regulatory issues as well. Now, on the trade side, we say that we're not as such doing the regulations. That's for the domestic side of things. But on the other hand, we do have principles that we believe should be taken into account when putting down or developing regulations. And again, we're back to the toolkit. So I think it's extremely important to get this toolkit out there. It's not going to be used by everyone, and it's not going to, parts of it is not going to be used, but at least it's a starting point for those who haven't started already. And I think I will then, not go into the weight of history. Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe I can take a small license as a moderator to make a personal observation on those three, because I think those are really interesting questions. I think on the weight of history, yes, one of the issues in this area is we never start with a blank slate. And when we start moving one measure or doing one thing, there's always a counterbalance. And certainly we need an holistic approach. One of the debates that we see raging, at least in the trade policy community, is if you have market dominance that's been built up in a sector, what are you going to do about it? And if that market dominance has been built on government support, is the way to combat that to do government support? But then what's the consequences of that? Do you end up spending a lot of your own money on government support? In order to make that fiscally sustainable, you have to erect trade barriers so that then you're keeping cheaper imports out. And soon you find yourself in a policy mix that maybe you didn't want to be. So I'm not arguing necessarily that that's always wrong, but this is a genuinely hard question, I think, that governments are struggling with now. What's the relative costs? In terms of, is it more important for developed or developing countries? I think it's important for everybody because these issues are shaping global markets. So however you're participating in these global markets, this is affecting you. And perhaps, Antonio, what would I say to keep our members on track? I would say, and I say this from somebody who thinks about subsidies and government support, everybody always thinks that the trade-off is the foreigners. Okay, so me versus their subsidies. Actually, the thing with government support is the trade-off is your own public expenditure. It's your own schools, hospitals and roads. So how do you want to spend your own public resources? And I think the benefits of competition, which at the risk of starting to sound like an advertisement, are also beautifully laid out in the Competitive Neutrality Toolkit, I think is the argument to make. Do I have other questions from the floor at this stage? Okay, if not, I'm going to ask the panel a harder one, because we talked about coordination across countries, and in terms of how you bring that together. Often the harder thing is coordination within countries and within governments, and across policy areas within governments. So what more can we do? Each of you are from different policy communities. What more can we do to do those bridges within countries? I'll start with you, Benedicta.
I think we basically, it sounds so drab. We need to talk more to one another. We talked about breaking down silos in the OECD between directors, between areas of responsibility, and we have to do the same back home as well. And there are opportunities to do so, but you have to be aware that the next guy, the next ministry is actually doing some lawmaking. So you have to have within your government the possibility to always be able to know what the next guy is doing. And so that's transparency within government. Then I think we need to, in this competitive neutrality area, as has been said, we come at it from different points of view and from different areas, but at the same time we need to be coherent. Again, we have to talk with each other. We have to agree on the language. What is the definitions that we are using? And how the effects and that impact assessment that you have in the toolkit is perhaps the most important thing about it, because making sure that you have that impact assessment goes a long way and ends up being a conversation as well. So yeah, it's not a very good answer, but that's basically what we have to do, I think.
I think transparency and communication is usually a pretty good answer. Kimmo, over to you.
Thank you. From the perspective of an SOE practitioner, one of the most important aspects of the toolkit within the government or within a country would be, in my view, the recommendation that when the state both regulates as a market and conducts an economic activities through SOEs, there should be a clear separation of the state ownership function from its other market regulation and policy-making functions. So this is the fundamental issue where many countries would have improvements to be seen. So as to prevent conflicts of the interest and ensure level playing field, this my wish would be, and which is in the toolkit as well, is important. And this is a key tenet and underlying principle of the SOE guidelines as well. In addition, all competitive neutrality considerations bearing on state support and public service obligations outlined in the toolkit are also particularly important to consider with regard to SOE operations in order to maintain a level playing field. And these have been fully incorporated in the recent edition of the guidelines. So these two major issues are both mentioned in the SOE guidelines and in a toolkit, and I would emphasize that they are probably two of the keys within the country to do.
Thanks. We have a good example of intragovernmental coordination already. Alberto, with you.
Oh, sorry, I didn't. Right. I agree that one of the most important things is to have greater communications. But of course, greater communications requires time. And I come from a country where everything is urgent. And if everything is urgent, then there is not much communication possible. I just tell you a story just to make things a little at hand less serious, but it's a serious issue. In 1992, I was asked to write a report on the restructuring of the electricity industry because at the time, the monopolist in Italy, Enel, was going maybe to be privatized. And I was told that I have to do it very, very quickly because otherwise it would be privatized and then the report would be useless. And 30 years after, Enel is still not privatized. This is to tell you that very often this urgency is artificial urgency. It's not a real urgency. And as a result, we shouldn't always think that everything should be done yesterday, not tomorrow. And I think that's the most important. There are countries that we should take as example that indeed have strategies and build things in advance. And so we should look at those countries, and then communications and coordination and cooperation would be easier. The country is the UK, of course, where I just say this, that when the OFT, the Office of Fair Trading, and the Monopoly and Mergers Commission, or at the time was called the Competition Commission, I think, were merged into the CMA, the decision was made that a merger would take place how many years after? 3 years after, in order to prepare. In every other country, nobody would have prepared anything, and they would wait 3 years and then merge. Instead, in the UK, there were all sorts of decisions being made so that the new institution would become more effective and well organized, and they achieved this. So I think urgency is an issue that should be addressed in order to make cooperation possible.
Thank you. I think that's a pretty good list from the panel. Look, we're getting to the end of our time, so I'm going to finish the panel with one last question on my part. I'm putting you back in the elevator. This time, no parking garages. It's 10 floors, and you smack down on the concrete. But this time you're in the elevator with the OECD Secretary General. And in those 10 floors, this is your moment to tell him what more the OECD should be doing on these issues. What should we be doing? So I'll start. I'm going to go Kimmo, Benedicta, Alberto. Kimmo.
Thank you. I guess that from the perspective of SOE practitioner, I would bring up the sustainability, which is a pressing issue. And therefore, in order to combine the toolkit, the guidelines, in order to make the green transition and highlight the requirement and the action to be needed in strategic sectors to have the sustainability work ongoing. That would be my request.
Thank you. Somebody always raises a really interesting issue on the last question, don't they? Okay, Benedict.
Well, with the Secretary General, I would say we have to continue to work on the level playing field. from a trade perspective, it's looking at continue to monitor, continue to look for best practices, and use the OECD to assist its members to find the right way to make more rules in this area.
Okay, thank you. And finishing with you, Alberto.
I would echo Alan Fels and say that the competition committee should be the general committee of the OECD, and all the others should be subsidiary bodies.
Yeah, we arranged for him to step out of the elevator early. So look, will you join me in thanking our panelists today for a very stimulating discussion. So thank you very much to all, and then I'll hand over for closing remarks. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you very much for the very good discussion, and thanks to all the public online and here. And now it's time to close. So I would like to invite our director, Carmine Di Noia, to deliver the closing remark. Thanks, everybody.
I was in the elevator with Secretary Jenna, so actually, thank you. The last comment could be also refer to DAF, but I have colleagues of the other director. No, so thanks a lot. I mean, it's late and it's great to be here. Actually, apologies. Because I couldn't, be here for the previous sessions. Actually, I was in Brussels. I went this morning in Brussels at the Commission, discussing, in an area where probably the toolkit and the level playing field is not so, and maybe there are many exceptions, which is financial markets and actually consolidation among, market infrastructures, industries that are characterized by, a lot of economies of scale, scope, network externalities, where we have, competition, on the one side, more competition and lower the barriers to entry, but at the same time, where incumbents actually have been strengthened a lot. Liquidity attracts liquidity, and not only, because there are also unintended consequences, I think, and silos and coordination should be probably more an issue, not only at the OECD, but actually maybe also at the Commission, but also everywhere. No, sometimes we start regulating monopolies or oligopolies, and these obviously can have the unintended consequence to strengthen them. Think about rating agencies, audit firms, now proxy advisors, or so it was actually an interesting discussion, and sorry for being here late. But I think actually this is an area where also the committee, and I'm biased obviously by my previous experiences, but competition financial markets is a fascinating issue. And again, with the exceptions and using transparency, Alberto was underlining this, is transparency is the best of disinfectants. Sometimes is a necessary but not sufficient condition. But so it's, I know that there's been a very good, discussion for all the sessions. Luckily, I was here for the last part of this one. And obviously, competition, it's important to promote, competitions in the toolkit, also as Antonio was also referring to, is a fundamental instrument to implement more and more also the recommendation. And it's important how also different policy communities can support these and support neutrality. Maybe 3 points, and which also came, at least 2 of them even in the last panel, but obviously competitive neutrality toolkit is a valuable instrument, and that can really help identify policies that may be distorted, and so at the detriment of a good level playing field. And so in many ways, this is sort of a cookbook for competitive markets, filled with all
many, tested already recipes from around the world. So offers a practical, I think, guidance and also solution for, developing approaches that minimize the distortions and can, promote fairer competition across sectors. As we heard, you heard in the opening remarks, so obviously the toolkit is aligned closely with instruments such as reminded. Thank you for the SOE guidelines, for example. That is one of our latest, important instruments, which actually look to promote level playing field between private and state-owned companies. So the toolkit also should be understood also in a broader, industrial policy context, given that also, all the ongoing discussions that are there in especially after, the events and the evolution we had in the last, years, and not only, thinking the crisis, COVID, and then all the also maybe due to the macroeconomic environment, also we have to rethink all our classical, thinking. I'm thinking of securities. I'm thinking of, policies and national policies, also due to unfortunate events like the wars that we are seeing. Maybe second, also in all the panels, so also afterwards, there were insights into, good practices, and this is also then what the toolkit and the work around the toolkit was about. So practices like Japan and Mexico, promoting, a level playing field, which sometimes means imposing, so asymmetric regulations to help new entrants, so in order to have more competition. The Spain example issuing guidance to public procurers on the benefits of competitive neutrality and on treating SOEs as normal bidders in public tenders, which is not always necessarily the case. And then the EU, that has one of the most comprehensive and developed frameworks on promoting competitive neutrality, which when the state provides support to one or more competitors, and these actually has inspired a lot of the good practices that related to state support outlined in the toolkit. And I think also this in particular in the last session, so we discussed how competitive neutrality matters go beyond competition policy. And then, obviously, for example, a lack of competition policy and its enforcement. So including actually many areas, and again, thinking again of financial markets, you may have other issues, thinking of financial stability, but then we have a lot of, rules, bankruptcy laws and other non-preferential treatment of SOEs, strict, transparency and subsidy, requirements. So this can negatively not only affect also the relationship with trading partners, and so this is something which is quite interesting. And so we heard also how SOEs, can distort competition due transparent or not or opaque advantages, financial conditions, rules, supervision, formal, informal. So this is very critical, and Alberto's reminded us in some situations of, in theory, privatized company, which are not necessarily. So I think all these discussions illustrated how we can work together, and this panel also is a great example to promote a level playing field, in practice. And I think, as in many other areas of the OECD, we have to work all together. OECD can do its part, but obviously we cannot do anything without, policy makers and then with market forces. So I think this is with our trade unions, with market players. And so we really hope that the toolkit can facilitate the implementation of the OECD recommendation on competitive neutrality. So thank you for being here. We had also we have to thank you all our delegates that supported the Secretariat in developing
the Competitive Neutrality Toolkit, and these include not only the delegates of the Competition Committee, and thank you, Frederic, and all the members, but also the work of, and we see here of the delegates of the Trade Committee and Corporate Governance Committee through the Working Party on SOEs and Regulatory Policy Committee. I think it was a really joint effort. Also the colleagues and all directorates, and also I like also the moderation of Julia, but all what we have done together with TAD, with Gov, and we in DAF. All the speakers today and the moderators. We had the opening by our DSG Takeuchi. Thanks, Frederic, for being here with us, and for your remarks and all the panelists. So thank you to all of you that are still here and also online, and for interest and participation. But this is not is not ending here, because now we have to work and use it. Otherwise, it would be a pity and an exercise that with an output that is not used. So thank you again for your attention and contribution. And actually, we look forward, all of us, Ori, our competition division, to engage with you directly with the committee. And again, I think this has been a great effort also from the OECD as a whole to show how we can all work together. Thank you.
Oui, 70, je pense. Et elle charge, oui, elle charge plus vite qu'avec un.